Education and Founding by Ralph C. Hancock for Fathom the Good. Part 1 Introduction. Chapter 1 The Intimate Link Between Political Foundations and Education. The task of education takes place within the framework of a political community. Political communities are dynamic. The character of citizens and the laws shape each other. Our roles as educators concern various goods of our students, as these are embedded in the common good of the community. Founders of cities and nations, from ancient Spartas like Lycurgus to the framers of the American Republic, have always attached great importance to education. It makes sense that educators should attend very carefully to the significance of founding. Education is essential to the founding of a political community because the security, stability, and prosperity of the city, or polis, the ancient Greek term for an independent political body, depend upon the moral character of the city's members as well as upon their understanding of the city's laws and customs. This is especially true in a free city or democratic republic, where the great body of the people enjoys rights protected by the city's constitution and responsibilities to defend and support the city and heed its laws. Educators work within the framework established by a founding, whether they know it or not. Teaching takes place within a context shaped not only by people's explicit laws and procedures, but by the customs, assumptions, and character traits that are suited to and encouraged by the laws. Of course, the influence works in both directions. A people's character and its laws shape each other, and this reciprocity between constitution and character is not fixed but dynamic. A constitutional order does much to shape a people's development over its history, and it also bends and stretches to adapt to social and economic changes. A founding is subject to adjustments and reinterpretations. These may be gradual and largely imperceptible, but eventually such changes lead to critical periods of constitutional development that need to be publicly debated and acknowledged in the public constitution. The years of the Great Depression and the New Deal provide one clear example of such a period of decisive constitutional reinterpretation. Moreover, a constitutional order may indeed be broken and need to be reconstituted. Thus, many scholars consider the reforming of the American order through the Civil War and consequent constitutional amendments to be a significant refounding of the United States. This is not to say that any founding, refounding, or reinterpretation of a constitutional order is over, absolutely settled, and beyond controversy. Each settlement leaves controversies and questions in its wake, but it is a settlement that, at least for a time, seals the authority of the certain laws, certain interpretations, and even a certain shared understanding of a way of life and of the character traits of that support it. And every new settlement or reinterpretation operates within the most fundamental premises laid down by the original settlement, by the founding. Unless the constitutional order has lost legitimacy and been replaced by a different constitutional order, then the original founding regains its shaping influence and all education takes place within its framework. Given this understanding of a fundamental link between political founding and education, let us consider the role of educators in relation to their country's founding principles. First, teachers would want to have an understanding of fundamentals of the constitutional order so as to be able to do their part to help equip students to be successful human beings and good citizens within that order. Every political community must reward the virtues or character traits that are most compatible with the overall well-being and sustainability of that community. Every republic or self-governing community, for example, ultimately requires citizens ready to sacrifice to defend the homeland against aggressors. But the health of a modern, economically expansive republic or liberal democracy also depends on citizens who pursue their own economic interests not only energetically but also honestly and responsibly, as well as creative and disciplined minds to fuel economic and technological progress. A primary task of education, then, is to assure the cultivation of hearts and minds apt to contribute to the good of the community and to prosper within it. Chapter 2 Civic Education for Loyalty and Leadership. Educators, as they seek both to instill loyalty and to develop leadership, have a vital interest in the founder's ideas. Great statesmen such as Abraham Lincoln and authors such as Alexis de Tocqueville help us achieve critical distance from contemporary ideologies, to understand the challenge of balancing liberty and equality, and to appreciate the importance of political and moral experience in the educator's task of shaping understanding. Education thus necessarily involves formation of character as well as the training of the intellect. It is a matter of affections and dispositions as much as of information and skills. The young Abraham Lincoln, in his Springfield Lyceum address of 1838 was quite emphatic on this effective side of the mission of education. Quote, as the Patriots of 76 did to the support of the Declaration of Independence, so to the support of the Constitution and laws, let every American pledge his life, his property, and his sacred honor. Let reverence for the laws be breathed by every American mother to the lisping babe that prattles on her lap. Let it be taught in the schools, in seminaries, and in colleges, and let it be written in primers, spelling books, and almanacs. Let it be preached from the pulpit, proclaimed in legislative halls, and enforced in courts of justice. And in short, let it become the political religion of the nation. The idea of political religion would have been somewhat controversial, perhaps even 180 years ago, and it certainly sounds a little extreme in today's context. But we are perhaps a little extreme in our own way if we imagine that civic education is a matter of mere neutral information or boundless diversity of opinion, and that it can do without a fundamental effective commitment to a shared tradition embodying a common understanding of the good supported by a constitutional order. Consider in this context perhaps the greatest political speech of the modern era, Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, 1863. There is no better place to turn than this speech to be reminded of how our basic civic commitments can be informed with deep spiritual meaning. Lincoln is speaking on a battlefield hallowed by the ultimate sacrifices made by soldiers in order to nobly advance a still unfinished work. Lincoln expresses the meaning of this ongoing work in his unforgettable last phrases, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that the government of the people, by the people, for the people shall not perish from the earth. This is poetry of a high order, which is to say, its meaning cannot be captured by some simply rational analysis. But let us note that the ultimate purpose of the task, the great task remaining before us, which was begun by our fathers 87 years ago, is the ideal of the government of, by, and for the people. In a word, the ideal of democracy. At the same time, it is clear that this idea of democracy is by no means some morally neutral or merely procedural or mechanical concept of defining an effective political system. Rather, it points to a deeply humane cluster of moral and spiritual goods that are taken to inform our political life. The nation is under God, by no means anything like a theocracy, but a political community that has reference to higher authority and higher ends of human existence. Freedom takes part in these higher ends, especially as a new birth of freedom is evoked, a freedom renewed by a new moral and civic covenant and by the ordeal of war. Now, 1 years after the birth of American freedom, are we still moved by these mystic chords of memory from Lincoln's first inaugural? Can we equip our students to hear these chords? Learning to hear these chords, to understand the basic principles they resonate to, and to know enough of our political fathers and mothers to include them in our bonds of affection is then the first and fundamental task of civic education. But there is a second educational task that builds upon this foundation, that of achieving a critical intellectual grasp of America's founding principles, an understanding of the founding sufficient to preserve it against ideological attack and distortion. This critical intellectual side of civic education, which becomes more prominent as our students become more advanced in their learning, addresses especially the particular needs of those among our students who aspire to leadership, who have the potential to exercise considerable influence by their examples and their arguments. Our role is to provide both personal examples, present and past, and well-rounded arguments in order to lay the foundation of a patriotism that reflects both a full heart and a discerning and well-informed mind. This intellectual side of patriotism has always been a distinguishing feature of the American civic spirit. Alexis de Tocqueville, the great French author who wrote about America in the 1830s, greatly admired the level of civic education he found among otherwise simple Americans. Any plain citizen, he found, could rehearse not only his rights, but the specific institutional features that secured these rights at both state and national levels. Tocqueville saw, moreover, that the rights to which Americans were attached were not mere abstractions, but were rooted in a rich experience of participation in local self-government. Americans knew whereof they spoke when they spoke about political and constitutional matters. It cannot be doubted that in the United States, the instruction of the people powerfully contributes to the purpose of the democratic republic, and such must always be the case, I believe, where the instruction which enlightens the understanding is not separated from the moral education which amends the heart. True information is mainly derived from experience, and if the Americans had not been gradually accustomed to govern themselves, their book learning would not help them much at the present day. If you question an American respecting his own country, his language will become as clear and precise as his thoughts. He will inform you that what his rights are and by what means he exercises them. He will be able to point out the customs which obtain in the political world. You will find that he is well acquainted with the rules of the administration and that he is familiar with the mechanism of the laws. The citizen of the United States does not acquire his practical science and his positive notions from books. The instruction he has acquired may have prepared him for receiving those ideas, but it did not furnish them. The American learns to know the laws by participating in the act of legislation, and he takes a lesson in the forms of government from governing. The great work of society is ever going on before his eyes, as it were, under his hands. The Americans, on the other hand, transport the habits of public life into their manners in private, and their country and the jury is introduced into the games of schoolboys, and parliamentary forms are observed in the order of a feast." Unquote. Today, our system has grown more complex and the power of decision-making has become more centralized and less widely dispersed. These are obstacles to civic education greater than those faced in the early republic. At the same time, deep cultural changes challenge many of the assumptions on which Republican citizenship was once based. Tocqueville was already worried that a passion for equality would upset the balance between equality and liberty that he found to be the saving grace of American democratic society. That balance, he thought, was preserved by a number of exceptional practical features of American life that were by no means reducible to democratic theory. Tocqueville argued, that is, that the health of democracy in America depended upon cultural traits, Christianity or residual Christian beliefs in morality, an affinity for free voluntary associations, and political institutions, constitutional restraints, federalism, that could not be derived from the pure idea of equality alone. Education for civic leadership in today's world would include critical reflection like Tocqueville's on the moral, religious, and cultural conditions of democratic freedom. Such reflection is not encouraged by prevailing assumptions concerning the meaning of democracy. For many, it is now taken to be obvious that that democracy is a self-sufficient end in itself. More democratic equals better, and at the same time that boundless diversity is an unanswerable cultural imperative, as if loyalty and solidarity were not at least as much characteristics of a good society. The civic leaders we educate will need experience in thinking about the social, moral, and economic conditions of freedom, and they will need to have learned to take some critical distance from contemporary ideologies, both right and left, that do not attend sufficiently to these conditions. This critical distance from contemporary ideologies would by no means imply uncritical acceptance of some pious but simplistic conception of the founding. The founders were far from agreeing on everything, and even in the very important matters on which they agreed, they generally recognized that there were no final, unequivocal solutions to the fundamental political problems. A founding requires compromise and adjustment, not only out of necessity, but because there are always competing principles that deserve their due. It has been pointed out, for example, by great students of the American founding such as Carey McWilliams and Herbert Storing, that much can still be learned today by giving a full hearing to the arguments of those who oppose the ratification of the Constitution, the Anti-Federalists. A critical constitutional patriotism suited to the challenges of contemporary leadership would thus involve an understanding of founding principles that included awareness of the strongest objections or alternatives to these principles. I will argue below that understanding the founders' negotiation between reason and experience, a bold project to prepare a new future along with due respect for the lessons of the past, is a key to appreciating their achievement. Such an appreciation is not a substitute for our own thinking as we engage in the political and intellectual challenge of our times, or for thinking of the students we are preparing to be leaders as citizens as well as individuals, but it is our premise that the founding does provide an exemplary case study in integrating rational progress with due reverence for inherited principles. In learning from the founding, we must avoid two opposite mistakes, as Gordon Wood suggests in Revolutionary Characters. 1. Worship of founders. This has long been a tendency in American political discourse, a good and necessary tendency up to a point, as even James Madison foresaw in Federalist 49. But by making the founders gods, we remove them from the circumstances and challenges that make them interesting and instructive and fail to enter into the challenging substance of their reasoning, as well as to recognize the constraints imposed on them by the circumstances in which they lived. 2. Dismissal of the founders, or presentism. The fashion of debunking the founders is far from new, and in fact the very word was invented 100 years ago to describe W.W. Woodward's takedown of the founders. Most famously, Charles Beard's economic interpretation of the Constitution tried, in Marxist fashion, to reduce the founders' intention to their class interests as men of property. But today, the spirit of debunking has moved from the world of scholarship to become a mainstay of culture and indeed of education at all levels. The defaming of the makers of the Revolution and Constitution as mere white male elites, racist and sexist ideologues defending their own privileges is more widespread than ever. This spirit of resentment towards the founders is closely connected, as Gordon Wood notes, with a repudiation of the very idea of absolute values or enduring truths. And so we see that the very idea of authority of the original intent of the Constitution has become controversial. As we shall see in Chapter 6, the French political philosopher Philippe Benetton helps us to understand the transformation behind this all too common dismissal of the founders. We think our relativist equality by default, in which rights are increasingly severed from duties and from virtue, is superior to the founders' understanding. Are we right to dismiss the founders? Our premise is that failure to attend carefully to the noble intentions and careful reasoning of the founders is a serious mistake with both intellectual and real moral political consequences. But this premise can only be supported by actually engaging with the founders' ideas. Part 2, Reason and Experience in Foundings. Chapter 3, America's Foundations, Rational, Moral, and Religious. America's foundations may be considered under three aspects: the classical, the modern, and the Christian. All three play a role in what the founders advance as the one non-negotiable principle of the American founding. Three conceptions of political morality. There are essentially three main ways of conceiving of the relationship between moral and political authority, or to state the matter another way, between personal morality and public or political morality. We can name them classical virtue, modern self-interest, and the two cities of Christianity. These three conceptions overlap and interact in complex ways, so their application to a given political argument is never simple. The case of the American founding is no exception to this complexity, and there is certainly no simple, final, and authoritative statement of a unified view of the founders concerning these three conceptions. Still, keeping these three main possibilities in mind can be very useful in grasping the founders' substantial consensus on the meaning and supports of constitutionalism, as well as the uncertainties and differences that remained among them. Classical virtue. In the first understanding of morality and politics, there is really no distinction between morality and politics, or between the personal and the political. Politics as we know it comes from the Greek polis, the Greek political and philosophical tradition initiated by Socrates, transmitted through the medium of Rome, remained an essential reference for the founders' generation. Scholars refer to this ancient stream of influence as the classical republican element in the founders' understanding. In this understanding, devotion to the public good is the essence of morality. For the ancients, ideas of right and wrong were closely bound up with pagan religious beliefs, and pagan religion was very much the religion of the city, of the immediate political community. As Jean-Jacques Rousseau wrote near the end of the 18th century, before Christianity there was no separation between the political and the religious. Every religion was uniquely attached solely to the laws of the state that prescribed it. The ultimate meaning of morality or virtue in this first classical conception is therefore simply conformity with the laws and customs of one's political community, one's homeland, and there is no higher good than the public good. Modern self-interest. Modern rationalism, or the philosophy of the Enlightenment, a philosophical and political movement that came into full flower in the 18th century Europe and had much influence in North America as well, presents itself in many respects as the direct opposite of the classical understanding. For the moderns, moral and political authority is justified with reference to the plain, material self-interest of the individual. All legitimate authority is based ultimately on consent, and real consent is rational consent, that is, consent granted in exchange for the protection of the individual's rational, natural rights, especially, to cite once again John Locke, the rights to life, liberty, and property. This is the second way to understand the relation between morality and politics. In this conception, government is not associated with some higher duty or order of meaning, but is simply a tool for the protection of the individual's right to pursue his own interests. Just a plain matter of reason and common sense, as we have read from John Adams. At the limit of this view, government becomes a mere mechanism, a system of institutional devices and procedures without any inherent purpose or morality, a machine that would go of itself, and as an American poet once said. Now, there are no pure cases in real life, and certainly Our founders' ideas were no pure examples of either classical republicanism or of modern enlightened self-interest, as I have described these views. Indeed, sorting out views of the relation between morality and politics is immediately complicated by the fact that the lofty classical language of the public good was often mobilized to support a modern, enlightened, and individualistic conception of political obligation. The two cities of Christianity. But the greatest complication that arises in seeking clarity on the founder's moral and political vision concerns Christianity. This is the third conception we need to keep in mind. A Christian understanding of politics cuts across the distinction we have drawn between one, classical public virtue, and two, modern rational self-interest. To return to Rousseau, the great French political philosopher, in the last chapter of The Social Contract, forcefully describes Christianity's fundamental transformation of the political problem. It was Jesus who, by introducing the new idea of an otherworldly kingdom, separated the theological system from the political system and destroyed the unity of the pagan state. One need not share Rousseau's nostalgia for pagan unity to recognize the seriousness of the challenge Christianity poses for political philosophy. We modern beneficiaries of a liberal democratic regime that many take to establish the separation of church and state may imagine that the spiritual and secular realms can be neatly divided and insulated from each other. But a moment's study of the actual politics of the United States, for example, would suffice to show that the very meaning and the terms of such a separation remain contentious political and philosophical questions. The heart of the problem is this: the separation of religion and politics stems from a religious view of politics, a Christian view, that is. It is Christianity that, uniquely in Western political and philosophical history, proposed a city of God as distinct from and far above the mere city of man, that is, the realm of politics. The task of absorbing and implementing this proposition has defined Western society since Rome became Christian, and we are still involved with this task today, whether we know it or not. And even for those who accept the Christian conception is true, there is no obviously right way to implement the idea of the two cities, the challenge of keeping faith with two distinct communities. Much as we might believe and hope that true religion and actual politics are ultimately separate, the fact remains that the concerns of this world and those of the next are very much tangled up in practice, and the status and meaning of morality are very much the center of that tangle. Moral obligation is a central concern of both religion, obedience to God's commands, edification of the soul, and of politics, obeying and sustaining law, serving one's country, goodwill towards fellow citizens. And there is no neat way completely to separate these religious and civic obligations. The Christian idea of man's obedience to a transcendent God in view of his otherworldly destiny complicates the fundamental alternative between one, the classical primacy of obligation to the polis or political community, and two, the modern attempt to ground political obligation in enlightened self-interest. On the other hand, the Christian idea of a transcendent source of obligation and concern for the higher good of the soul may seem to extend and support the classical citizen's regard for a good higher than his or her own self-interest. This was the way the relationship between the two cities, the church and the civil government, were generally interpreted throughout the Christian Middle Ages. The duty to obey the king was considered part of our duty to obey God. On the other hand, however, the proposition of a second, higher city, our otherworldly destiny, can have the effect of diminishing the moral importance of the earthly city, which is thus seen as a mere secular realm. The idea of a secular realm is thus, in the first place, a Christian idea. As St. Augustine wrote, since it is the Holy Church that cares for the eternal good of our souls, then civil government is competent only to manage a kind of compromise concerning those things merely necessary to our mortal existence. If the Church cares for souls, then the state is concerned only with bodies, with the bare requirements of peace and order. Thus Christian arguments have been made, since the time of the Protestant Reformation, and hearkening back to Augustine, that the purpose of government is limited and secular, and having nothing to do with the soul's higher good. We will see examples of such arguments from John Adams and Christian preachers of the American Revolution, who embraced from a Protestant perspective the essentials of John Locke's rational theory of government limited to the protection of natural rights. The core of American republicanism. Keeping in mind these three main ways, classical, modern, and Christian, of understanding the purpose of politics and the source of political obligation will greatly help to clarify the meaning of the founder's thought. Federalist 39 states the one non-negotiable principle of the American founding, quote, The first question that offers itself is whether the general form and aspect of the government be strictly republican. It is evident that no other form would be reconcilable with the genius of the people of America, with the fundamental principles of the Revolution, or with that honorable determination which animates every votary of freedom to rest all our political experiments on the capacity of mankind for self-government. If the plan of the convention therefore be found to depart from the republican character, its advocates must abandon it as no longer defensible. Unquote. The genius or fundamental character of the American people requires popular or republican government. Madison acknowledges here that to form a government on such a principle is an experimental venture that depends finally on the capacity of mankind for self-government. Self-government is a rich and important term. It refers to the first instance to the people's collective worthiness to hold the ultimate power in society. We may, Madison writes, define a republic to be, or at least may bestow that name on, a government which derives all its powers directly or indirectly from the great body of the people, and is administered by persons holding their offices during pleasure for a limited period or during good behavior. But the term self-government also implies the individual's capacity to govern himself, and it reminds us that there are attributes of moral character that are essential to republican citizenship. Chapter 4. Immoderate Reason in the French Revolution. The distinctive character of the American Revolution comes to light in comparison with the extremism of the French Revolution. The French Revolution, as Tocqueville saw, was philosophically as well as socially radical, almost like a religious revolution. The elites of the French Revolution sought to break radically with the past and to effectuate a regeneration of mankind through human means. As Americans rallied to fight for their independence and to establish new state constitutions on true principles, they naturally focused on what was new and revolutionary in their understanding of government. We will see that as they undertook the task of founding a new federal constitution a decade later, they were brought to pay more explicit attention to the value of experience and continuity. But even in the rhetoric of the American Revolution, we can see a certain balance between the motives of innovation on the one hand and on the other of prudent preservation of inherited norms and principles. John Adams, for example, as we have just seen, calls boldly for a new politics of enlightened common sense in a religious language inherited from his Puritan ancestors. Alexis de Tocqueville provides a key to grasping together both the truly revolutionary and the conservative dimensions of the American founding. He explained that America was in a sense born free, speaking of the net effect of its settlement in the New World and its unique colonial history, far removed from the center of the empire in London, and did not have to break radically with its past to become free. Thus, Americans were privileged to smuggle into their political principles a certain essential continuity with their English colonial past, under cover of the rhetoric of radical revolution. Americans knew in their bones from deep experience what it meant to be free and equal, and so freedom and equality were not explosive, boundless abstractions as they were in the French Revolution. As will be demonstrated more fully in Chapter 6, we might say, along with Philippe Benetton, that the American idea of equality preserved a certain substantial, morally grounded, and moderate character that saved it from both ideological subversion, the French Revolution, and, at least for a considerable time, from dissolving into a formless and relativistic equality by default. The contrast between the American and French revolutions is very instructive. Alexis de Tocqueville provides a key to the violent radicalism of the French Revolution when he observes that it was, quote, a political revolution that proceeded in the manner of religious revolutions, unquote. It promised by political means to accomplish an end formerly thought to be beyond politics, the regeneration of mankind. New institutions and new policies were mere instruments in the creation of new human beings who had escaped all limitations, troubles, and perplexities that earlier ages had assumed to inhere necessarily in the human condition. Such a creation clearly requires a radical repudiation of the beliefs, habits, and institutions of the past. These must be destroyed in order to allow the emergence of regenerate humanity. The attempt to effect such a rupture is nicely summarized in the introduction of a new rationalized calendar. The new age would not accept the burden of 1,792 years from the Christian calendar, but would start afresh from the year 1. The logic of the Terror, the most violent phase of the French Revolution, follows from this radical project of destroying the past and creating a new humanity. In the first place, the past is a hard thing to kill. The people who are supposed to be eager to be reborn as free and equal find it hard to break old habits. They require more and more aggressive midwives to bring them forth. Second, regeneration is by its nature a difficult thing to define, and thus to limit. It could have no public and settled meaning until a new public is created. The aims of the revolution must thus be entrusted to a visionary vanguard that refuses all accountability to allegedly higher authorities, whether religious, moral, or political. A new and radical elitism, one could say, follows from the extreme appeal to the people as a pure and exclusive source of moral and political authority, exclusive of religion and tradition. There is then a certain consistency in the revolution's appeal to the authority of the people to justify violence against the population. For the people evoked as sovereign are not the actual concrete human beings who supply grist for the mills of the Terror, but the regenerate people, which does not yet exist except as a project of the revolutionary vanguard. This is, of course, not to say that the French people, in the ordinary concrete sense, played no role in the revolution. The necessity of winning the support of a critical mass of the population, and particularly the Parisian mob, was essential to the calculations of all revolutionary factions. It is precisely the ambiguity of the people in the revolutionary vocabulary that enables the vanguard to appeal to real popular interests and prejudices in creating the institutional machinery necessary for social regeneration. The masses are the engine of the revolution, but only an elite revolutionary corps can provide engineers and drivers. The people must be fed and flattered to provide the power to create the people, an elusive ideal of a new order based on a purely immanent secular authority. With all traditional, institutional, and moral restraints reduced to dust and ashes, there is nothing to check the dynamics of demagoguery. Whatever party, faction, or individual can best manipulate the people can claim to speak for the people. Whoever rides the tiger of popular favor at a given moment possesses not only the keys to power, but the only recognized touchstone of truth. The support of the mob becomes the foundation of power, and power the only available criterion of truth. Thus, Robespierre's justice is not contaminated by any residue of traditional morality. Any act that advances the revolution, as defined by those empowered to define it, is by that very fact a just act. To punish the oppressors of humanity is mercy. To pardon them is barbarism. It follows that evil is embodied in the enemies of the revolution, a category indistinguishable not only in practice, but in principle from the perceived enemies of the revolution, the enemies designated by whoever is empowered to define the revolutionary categories. Repudiating the very possibility of a moral horizon common to regenerate and unregenerate alike, the revolutionary mentality produces a Manichaean vision of the social world. We embody the good and everyone who is not with us as evil. The vision of a new humanity erases all moral distinctions except one between those who have the power to define themselves as friends of humanity and those who find themselves defined as its enemies. Between the people and their enemies, there is nothing left in common but the sword, declared Saint-Just, Robespierre's most loyal disciple. The winners of each struggle for power are entitled, indeed called upon, to treat the losers as devils to be vanquished or insects to be crushed. This Manichaean struggle for power over language and thought, as well as institutional machinery, is a pervasive theme of the revolution. The elusiveness of the promise of regeneration, the absolute and therefore ever receding character of the end that justifies the pains of the revolution, produces successive phases of radicalization. To acknowledge the impossibility of the salvation of humanity by human beings would be to forsake the revolution altogether. The only possible response to the inevitable failure to regenerate is thus to concentrate the power of the revolution by designating more enemies to be blamed and punished. Since the purity of the revolution itself cannot be questioned, there is no choice but to enlarge the search for devils, for counter-revolutionary conspirators, hidden among the people or disguised among elite. Without new enemies to feed upon, the revolution cannot sustain itself, precisely because the dream is indefinite, almost spiritual. It can assert its reality only in consuming flesh and blood. Purges and pogroms are essential to the dynamics of social salvation. Thus, the distinctive features of the terror, concentration of power of the people in the hands of a few, merciless liquidation of enemies, real or perceived, construction of a new moral vocabulary, irresistible radicalization, issue from a fundamental commitment to the regeneration of humanity by human means. Although this commitment came fully to light only in the terror of 1793 and 94, the extreme logic of the French Revolution is traceable to radical principles announced from the beginning in 1789. In particular, the core idea of regeneration figures prominently in revolutionary rhetoric from the outset. Indeed, 10 years before the fall of the Bastille, a French ideologue, Garat, gave voice to the all too common dream, quote, "Let us institute laws for wisdom and for happiness, and surely we will see on earth only wise and happy men. Then all will be accomplished. Mankind will have but to rejoice in life," unquote. The extremism of the French Revolution follows from the extremism of its theory, from its ambition to base morality and politics on pure reason and to break radically with the past. Chapter 5, Reason and Experience, America's Foundations and Roots. The prudence of the American Revolution contrasts with the extreme ambition of the French Revolution. The first two Federalist Papers serve as an example of the balance and wisdom inherent in the American Revolution. British statesman Edmund Burke, friend of the American Revolution and critic of the French Revolution, explains how the American idea of freedom was marked by its particular history. The American colonists, in breaking with the British Empire and thus to a considerable degree with their English past, of course understood themselves to be revolutionaries. By appealing to the natural rights of human beings as such, they intended to found government on rational principles available in principle to all human beings everywhere. At the same time, unlike the French revolutionaries, the Americans' understanding and practice of these principles was informed by their real experience in self-government, their prudent attention to the particular character and circumstances of the American people, and by their respect for moral principles inherited from the long Western religious and philosophical tradition. The comparison between the French and American Revolution will be developed further in Part 4, with particular attention to each revolution's declaration of its principles. The American balance of innovation and experience, the moderate rationalism and prudent innovation of the American founders, is nicely represented in the very first two articles of the Federalist Papers, the great collection of arguments published in the New York Press and elsewhere by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay in 1787 and 88 to explain the newly drafted Constitution and argue for its ratification. In Federalist 1, Alexander Hamilton appeals to the pride of the Americans in undertaking a great and unprecedented political experiment on behalf of humanity. Quote, "It has been frequently remarked that it seems to have been reserved to the people of this country by their conduct and example to decide the important question whether societies of men are really capable or not of establishing good government from reflection and choice, or whether they are forever destined to depend for their political constitutions on accident and force," unquote. Whereas all previous political power or authority has been a matter of accident and force, Americans have an opportunity to demonstrate the possibility of founding government on reflection and choice, that is, on a rational conception of the purpose and limits of a just political order. At the same time, though, Hamilton recognizes the inevitable role played in human affairs by passions and interests that give a false bias to the judgment of even wise and good men on the right side of great political questions, and so counsels moderation in the people's expectations of rational deliberation. Reflection and choice, in other words, will never be matters of pure and universal reason. The limits of pure reason in politics are even clearer in the argument of Federalist 2. Here, John Jay appeals to the effective unity of the American people, a sense of common membership that precedes and transcends all rational calculation and individual rights. Quote, "I have as often taken notice that Providence has been pleased to give this one connected country to one united people, a people descended from the same ancestors, speaking the same language, professing the same religion, attached to the same principles of government, very similar in their manners and customs, and who, by their joint counsels, arms, and efforts, fighting side by side throughout a long and bloody war, have nobly established general liberty and independence," unquote. Jay's description of American unity was no doubt an exaggeration when he wrote these words, and could not in any case be applied directly to later, more pluralistic circumstances of American democracy. But the fundamental truth remains that constitutional order rests on implicit bonds and a higher sense of shared purpose, which cannot be reduced to any purely rational and instrumental explanation. The historical sources of the American character, that is, the non rational roots of the practical reality of the American theory of government based on rational consent, were well discerned by the great British orator and statesman Edmund Burke. Burke was as much a friend of the cause of American independence as he was a greatest critic of the extreme rationalist pretensions of the French Revolution. And he saw clearly that the promise of an independent American republic rested as much on the historically formed character of the American people as upon any abstract principles of the Enlightenment. Edmund Burke's great Speech on Conciliation with the Colonies discerns 6 principal historical roots of America's attachment to the cause of rational liberty. 1. Dissent. The Americans are not only devoted to liberty, but to liberty according to English ideas and on English principles. This devotion to liberty, supported by rational arguments, but also dependent on a long English history, was especially prominent in the Americans' attachment to the principle no taxation without representation. 2. Form of government. The Americans' colonial legislative assemblies are popular in a high degree. Some are merely popular. In all, the popular representative is the most weighty, and this share of the people in their ordinary government never fails to inspire them with lofty sentiments and with a strong aversion from whatever tends to deprive them of their chief importance. 3. Religion in the northern provinces. The New Englanders were heirs of a radical strain of Christianity. Burke writes, quote, "The people are Protestants, and of that kind which is the most adverse to all implicit submission of mind and opinion. This is a persuasion not only favorable to liberty, but built upon it. I do not think, sir, that the reason of this averseness in the dissenting churches from all that looks like absolute government is so much to be sought in their religious tenets as in their history. Everyone knows that the Roman Catholic religion is at least coeval with most of the governments where it prevails, that it has generally gone hand in hand with them and received great favor and every kind of support from authority. The Church of England, too, was formed from her cradle under the nursing care of regular government, but the dissenting interests have sprung up in direct opposition to all the ordinary powers of the world, and could justify that opposition only on a strong claim to natural liberty. Their very existence depended on the powerful and unremitted assertion of that claim. All Protestantism, even the most cold and passive, is a sort of dissent. But the religion most prevalent in our northern colonies is a refinement on the principle of resistance. It is the dissidence of dissent and the Protestantism of the Protestant religion. This religion, under a variety of denominations agreeing in nothing but in the communion of the spirit of liberty, is predominant in most of the northern provinces, unquote. 4. Manners in the southern colonies. Where slave owners, proprietors of large plantations, were socially dominant, the haughtiness of domination combines with the spirit of freedom. 5. Education. The study of law, so widespread in the colonies, think of John Adams, for example, renders men acute, inquisitive, dexterous, prompt in attack, ready in defense, full of resources. They augur misgovernment at a distance and snuff the approach of tyranny in every tainted breeze. 6. Remoteness of the American situation from the supposed center of their government. 3,000 miles provided for a salutary neglect by the empire that allowed self-government to develop in the colonies. In sum, the Americans who proclaimed a new order of the ages based upon a rational theory of natural rights and government by consent were drawing deeply on English and Christian experience. Gordon Wood, in his chapter of Revolutionary Characters on the Founders and the Enlightenment, depicts the American founders as committed to the Enlightenment ideals of equality and rational liberty, but at the same time shaped by a gentleman's ethic of traditional liberal education and virtuous and disinterested public service that was by no means a product of reason alone. Indeed, Wood writes, the intense self-conscious seriousness with which they made that commitment to virtuous political leadership was what ultimately separates them from later generations of American leaders. We must hope, surely, that the separation of present and future leaders from the founders' civilized ideal of virtuous political responsibility is not absolute. As R.B. Bernstein writes in The Founding Fathers, a very short introduction, the Founding Fathers engaged in a creative argument between past and present about the future. Quote, Two themes undergird the founding fathers' struggles. The first is their sense of firstness. When independence became feasible and necessary, they faced the task of defining what it would mean, what kind of independent government they would have, what kind of politics they would practice under that government, and what kind of laws they would make. The second is their sense of connectedness to history and posterity, to generations gone before and generations yet to come. Their sense of firstness did not divorce them from the past nor from the future, but rather intensify their connections with past and future, unquote. We have seen that the new and the old, reason and experience, progress and tradition were interwoven in America's foundations. In future discussions, we will examine more specifically the rational content and moral character of these foundations. Part 3, Equality and Moral Liberty. Chapter 6, Civic Education and the Problem of Equality. What do we mean by equality? French political philosopher Philippe Benetton distinguishes between substantial equality and equality by default. Benetton relates the American founding to 3 stages of the rights of man. He considers what the modern idea of equal rights owes to Christianity and in what sense it is non-Christian and even anti-Christian. Benetton argues that the political rhetoric of individual rights planted a kind of time bomb in American society. Benetton's account of the radicalization of the idea of equality points to the importance of civic education in our understanding of the founding. Civic education cannot then avoid the task of coming to terms with current objections and alternatives to constitutional principles as understood by the founders. Many of the strongest of such objections stem from the historical link between the Constitution and America's original sin, that is, racial slavery, and from the long history of racial discrimination that issued from this tragic founding flaw. The question of race, in turn, becomes implicated in much later appeals to non-discrimination as a basic principle of justice. This question of the meaning of equality in relation to racial and other forms of discrimination we intend to address, at least briefly, further on. First, though, we must address alternative understandings of the idea of equality itself. This idea is obviously central to our civic understanding, and much depends on getting clear on its meaning and implications. Equality is clearly a powerful idea in our moral and political discourse today, as it was for the founding generation. Much then depends on its meaning. What implications does the word carry today, and are these consistent with the intention of the founding? If the meaning of equality has undergone a significant transformation, then the critical understanding of the Constitution necessary for wise leadership today would need to take account of this change. An important argument concerning such a significant transformation of the meaning of equality has been offered by Philippe Benetton, author of Equality by Default. Like Alexis de Tocqueville 170 years earlier, Benetton offers a critical French perspective on American life and institutions, one that helps us to achieve a certain intellectual distance from the dominant assumptions of our political and social world. Benetton draws a very general but important distinction between substantial equality and equality by default. Substantial equality informed the deliberations of moderate liberals such as the American founders. It held human beings to be created equal by the same God and therefore by right equal under the law. Substantial equality is equality by virtue of a common human substance, a common human nature. It is perfectly compatible with significant inequalities in merit and in fortune. For Benetton, substantial equality is true to human nature. It recognizes the truth of human equality. We are all equally human, and therefore equally share a certain spiritual dignity. And of human inequality, people simply differ in physical and intellectual qualities as well as in moral excellence. We are all alike before we are different. We share a common humanity, and yet our differences are socially, morally, and politically significant. In Benetton's account, substantial equality is primary, fundamental, true to human nature, and Christian. It holds equality and inequality together, and it brings men together. Substantial equality demonstrates that men are more alike before they are different. It recognizes the dignity of every human being as children of God. Quote, such is the supernatural equality of Christian teaching, the equality of the children of God. Human beings are equal because they are of the same family, all beloved children of God, that Father, and therefore all brothers, because they are all heirs of the same history of love and fidelity, creation, fall, redemption, because they all share the same conditions, sin, and the same destiny, supernatural. All are of the same high birth, all injured by original sin, all redeemed and worthy of God's blood, all called to participate in divine felicity. Unquote. Equality by default, on the other hand, attacks the very idea of merited inequality of moral desert by denying the very substance of our common human nature. We are then, on this view, equal merely by default, that is, owing to the lack of any common ethical standard. Substantial equality presupposes a common moral standard. Equality by default relativizes all standards, and it attempts to base equality on the sheer right to be or do whatever one wants, subject to the prohibitions of obvious and immediate harm to others, of course. Equality by default is an ideological abstraction that is untrue to human nature. In fact, it rejects the very idea of substantive, morally significant human nature. It rejects all vital distinctions and tends to reduce our humanity to pure indeterminacy. It is an equality that is emptied of all substance. It represents a total break from Western humanism, a state in which man is a stranger in the universe because he is liberated from every norm and every order that transcends him. Equality by default attempts to eliminate all differences under the banner of diversity and radical autonomy. It levels, debases, and divides. Equality by default proclaims that people may live as they please, but eliminates the foundation of mutual respect or appreciation for what it means to be human or what it means to be free. This is because, in order for men to be equally and radically autonomous, they must have nothing in common but the freedom to have nothing in common. In sum, what is the essential difference between substantial equality and equality by default? Substantial equality brings men together, equality by default separates them. In assigning these concepts of equality to broad stages of the rights of man, Benetton helps to situate our study of the founding. The first stage, that of moderate liberalism, he in fact associates with the American founding fathers. This was the great age of substantial equality, in which the revolutionary proclamation of human equality, according to nature and under God and the laws, and the law was balanced by a very broad and solid consensus on basic moral and religious truths that differentiate right from wrong and noble from base. The next stage, that of the ideological subversion of the language of equal rights, Benetton associates with the radical phase of the French Revolution and with the communist revolutions of the 20th century that saw themselves as heirs of that radical revolution. The final stage, which is essential to that question of critical civic education today, is precisely that of equality by default. This new understanding, which rose to prominence and even dominance beginning in the social turmoil of the 1960s, departs decisively and profoundly from the founders' idea of liberty and equality as grounded in a substantial understanding of human nature and an understanding that takes full account of both the human potential for a definite moral good and the human vulnerability to corruption. According to Benetton, because the moral and indeed broadly religious foundations of liberty and equality were largely assumed by the founders, their political rhetoric emphasizing individual rights had the effect of planting a kind of time bomb in American society. Once the religious and moral conditions of substantial equality and ordered liberty were eroded by the ongoing pressure of the claims of equality, then the language of rights necessarily veered towards equality by default. In other words, individual rights were understood moderately in the American founding because they were moderated by family, education, and religion, particularly the limits on conduct provided by Christian morality. What happened? According to Benetton, the rights of man grew out of the soil of Christianity and the roots remained strong for a long time. Not until the storms of the 60s swept everything away did the radical idea of the sovereignty of the individual shake off all limits. Only then did the principle of equality take on its most radical form. Thus, modernity became the era in which men are defined by their rights. Quote, the effect of this evolution has been to empty the universalism of the rights of man of all substance. Men are the same, but they no longer have anything in common but the pure and indeterminate equal freedom. Man, as a sovereign, no longer has an end specified to his nature. His rights are not defined by his human nature. Instead, his very rights define him as human. The universalism of the rights of man is reduced to mere procedures, and thus these rights are without foundation. For how can the rights of man be grounded rationally if man is reduced to his rights? How can one invoke the source of human dignity if there is no criterion by which to distinguish worthy from unworthy conduct? Unquote. If Benetton is right, then education for critical civic leadership in today's world would include highlighting the moral foundations the founders could often take for granted, bringing into focus the moral conditions of equal freedom that were not in question in the late 18th century. Happily, as we shall see, our founders did not always take it for granted that the substantial foundations of liberty and equality and morality and human nature, and we can learn much from what they had to say on this subject. If America's freedom needs another redeeming rebirth, then tomorrow's leaders still have much to learn from the founders. Chapter 7, The Founders' Equality, John Locke and Religion in America. We have much to learn today from the principles of the founders as well as from their wise implementation of these principles. That is, the founders provide us with examples of wisdom in practice and not just in theory. A key source of the founders' theory of equal rights, which they shared with the philosophical movement known as the Enlightenment, were the late 17th century works of John Locke. Key concepts in Locke's philosophy include the state of nature, social compact, consent, and protection of life, liberty, and property. Today, the language of rights seems largely to have succumbed to the relativistic logic of equality by default. Claims of rights were once understood to be principles grounded in a higher law, which resonated with noble purposes shared with a community of citizens. Now, claims of rights often seem to be little more than rhetorical masks for whatever an individual or group may find it expedient to demand from others or from the government. How are we to address the contemporary cacophony of rights claims? The American political tradition is unique in having preserved a high degree of respect for a constitution founded over 2 centuries ago. Although the meaning of the principles underlying this constitution are clouded by great changes in our society since the time of the founding and by the clamor of partisan interpretations, we approach the founders' constitution with a reasonable hope of discovering principles and approaches that can still serve us well today. We thus undertake our study of the founders' own conception of our constitutional order in the hope of rediscovering an understanding of equality and of rights that is both morally higher and politically more solid and stable than what is typically on offer in today's political discourse. This hope is based on the reasonable premise that, although times have changed very significantly, there are certain enduring features of human nature and of the human condition that make the founders' insights into the meaning of equal rights relevant to contemporary moral and political problems. We have an interest, then, in putting aside the contemporary assumption of relativism, to each his own truth, in order to take seriously the founders' claim to have access to true principles of political right. But there is also another sense in which we may reasonably hope to learn from the founders. For the builders of our constitutional order never imagined that it was enough to be right about basic principles, that in order to lay the foundations for a free, secure, and stable society, it sufficed to see clearly into the basic principles of human nature. They understood as well, as we shall see, that much wisdom, virtue, and discretion were required in the application of such principles to the specific circumstances they confronted in America in the later part of the 18th century. It is far from sufficient, that is, to be right about basic principles. It is also necessary to be judicious and moderate in the implementation of those principles. The founders were not dealing directly with universal human nature, but with real human beings, inevitably motivated by particular interests and shaped in their habits and beliefs by a particular historical experience. Thus, we can look to the founders as examples to guide us in our regrounding our understanding of equal rights, not only in theory but also in practice. We look to them, that is, not only for their philosophical insights, but for their examples of wise and virtuous, though certainly not morally or intellectually perfect, statesmanship. The first place to look for a political theory held in common by the founders would be the philosophy of Englishman John Locke. Locke is considered the father of the European intellectual movement we call the Enlightenment, as well as America's philosopher. Despite significant differences among the founders on some matters of policy, almost all of them embraced a basic understanding of political morality that he had articulated most famously and influentially. This is not to say that the spirit of the founding was necessarily aligned with the whole of Locke's philosophy. The epistemology or theory of knowledge he developed in his essay concerning human understanding, for example, took a position of radical skepticism concerning foundations of moral and religious knowledge that went well beyond any mainstream position in the American founding. But the basic political principles he laid down, especially in his second treatise of government, echo in a great number of official documents and public arguments of the revolutionary and constitutional periods. Most notably, as we will see further on, Locke's imprint is quite plain in the most general propositions announced in the Declaration of Independence. Much of the power of Locke's essential political teachings lies in its clarity and simplicity. The broad lines of its argument are still quite familiar to politically attentive people with little formal acquaintance with political theory and its history. Locke posits a pre-political condition of humanity, a state of nature without political authority. In this state of nature, mankind is governed only by the law of nature, which directs the individual first to his own physical self-preservation, and secondarily to the preservation of other people insofar as this does not conflict with his primary right or duty to preserve himself. The natural state is a state of equality precisely because it is a state of freedom. It is a state of free equality or equal freedom because no man in the natural condition has a right to rule any other man. Human beings are not equal in strength, intelligence, or beauty, but each possesses an equal right to run his own life. Since no political authority exists in the state of nature, it follows that all such authority derives from convention, that is, from covenant or contract. Government is made by individuals who agree together to institute in order to serve their individual ends. These ends are the obvious ones: the protection of life, liberty, and property, meaning not just property that people happen to hold at a given moment in time, but in particular the right to acquire property by one's wit and industry, and to have it secured by the power of government to which one has consented. To create a government by the consent of the governed requires the provision of three functions missing in the state of nature: law, the legislative power; a fair judge of individual cases, a judicial power; and a power to carry out or implement the law, the executive power. Locke combines the judicial and executive power, which includes the conduct of foreign policy, into one institution, the constitutionalized monarchy and its agents, and separates the legislative power, Parliament, from it. Montesquieu will take the next step of institutionally separating the judicial and executive powers. These powers make up the legitimate arms of the government, but their legitimacy extends only so far as their faithfulness to the purpose for which they were instituted, the protection of the rights of the governed. Legitimate government is by definition limited government. The just power of the government is confined to the protection of the rights of the governed, of course including all powers such as taxation, police powers, defense, etc., necessary to the performance of that essential purpose. When a government violates the just limits on its powers, it essentially rebels against the original contract or returns to a state of nature, and thus a state of war, leaving its former subjects no choice but to defend themselves by putting down the illegitimate government and authorizing a new one in its place. These are in broad outline the main principles of John Locke's political theory. They provide this consensual core of principles through which the founders continually appeal. At the heart of this theory is an idea of natural equality that is at the same time an idea of natural freedom. All human beings are born free and equal because they are born without obligation to any human authority except government to which they have consented. To be sure, for most people not born into a state of nature, this consent will be implied or tacit, presumed from their accepting the benefits of the government under which they live. But the fact remains that the government is limited by the rational purposes for which it must be understood to have been instituted, the protection of rights to life, liberty, and property. John Locke's social contract, or compact theory of government, has become practically common sense for the generations of the American Revolution and the establishment of the Constitution. And it is notable that this basic theory of political right was seen to derive as much from biblical belief as from rational theory. Typically, the religious statement of Lockean principles was accompanied by a distinctly Protestant rejection of mysteries where authority is concerned. Daniel Shute, in a formal address of 1768, at once religious and political, known as an election sermon, affirmed that political principles ought to be as plain as the nature of the thing will permit. Mysteries in civil government relative to the rights of people, like mysteries in the laws of religion, may be pretended, and to the like purpose of slavery, this of the souls and that of the bodies of men. The whole substance of these plain principles is that civil rulers' purpose is to be the guardians of the natural and constitutional rights of their subjects. And it is notable that the protection of rights has implications that go well beyond what would be considered legitimate by many today. Shute points out three main means by which governments serve the cause of the people's rights. 1, the promotion of prosperity through commerce, progress in the arts and sciences, and diligent labor. 2, the promotion of wisdom through the education of youth. And 3, the suppression of vice and support of virtues as a foundation for social happiness. John Tucker, in an election sermon of 1771, directly confronts the apparent contradiction between the Lockean theory of government by consent and the biblical teaching in Paul's letter to the Romans that political authority comes from God. There is no contradiction, Tucker argues. What Paul means is that God creates man in a state of freedom with the rational capacity to found government on consent, and such government has no need to appeal to mysteries. In this way, the revealed teaching that government comes from God appears to be perfectly reconciled with the teaching of enlightened reason that government is founded on consent. John Adams, one of the leading founders, architect of the first Constitution of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and later second President of the United States, in his dissertation on the canon and feudal law, powerfully expresses the fusion of Protestant and Enlightenment arguments and sentiments for government based on natural rights and thus on the consent of the governed. Decrying the nonsense and delusion and the fantastical ideas of the canon law of the Roman Church, which had thrown such a glare of mystery, sanctity, and reverence over the questions of civil government, Adams commends the good sense of the civil and religious principles of the Americans, and he connects these principles with the public obligation for educating young citizens. Quote, "They knew that government was plain, simple, intelligible thing, founded in nature and reason and quite comprehensible by common sense. Their civil and religious principles, therefore, conspire to prompt them to use every measure in their power to propagate and perpetuate knowledge, so that the education of all ranks of people was made the care and expense of the public in a manner that I believe has been unknown to any other people, ancient or modern." Unquote. Chapter 8, Reason, God, and the Common Good in Two Revolutions. A comparison of the American Declaration of Independence and the French Declaration of the Rights of Man elucidates the virtue of self-government. Although the French and the Americans shared the same basic Enlightenment vocabulary, the Americans had a firm foundation in practical political experience, and their theory was embedded in and thus limited by inherited moral and political beliefs. The difference between the French and the American understandings of God, nature, and human nature reflects important differences between the two revolutions. The meaning of self-government in the founding may be clarified by returning to our consideration of the American and French revolutions, and specifically to a comparison between the two great declarations, the American Declaration of Independence and the French Declaration of the Rights of Man. Both revolutions appealed to rights inherent in all human beings. The Declaration in 1789 indeed appears in many respects a close relation to, if not a twin, to our Declaration of 1776. The most well-known passages of the 1776 document, proclaiming the self-evident truths that all men are created equal and that they possess inalienable rights, including rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that popular consent is the source of political authority organized to secure these rights, find clear echoes in 1789. The first article of the French Declaration proclaims that human beings are born free and equal in rights. The second makes the goal of political association in the preservation of these rights, including liberty and property. Both the French and the American statements speak the basic political vocabulary of the Enlightenment of the 18th century, which in turn may be traced to the central ideas of John Locke's political treatises of 1690. The two declarations appear to derive from a common and distinctly modern philosophic program. Ecclesial and aristocratic prejudices are to be stripped away to reveal and to liberate human nature. The differences are, however, important, indeed decisive. The framers of the French Declaration, although ready to acknowledge the value of American precedents, including the Declarations of Rights published by various states, were eager to surpass them to produce what they believed to be a more purely rational and universal statement. In particular, they found that the Americans did not break radically enough with their English past. Despite the ringing statements of abstract principles of equality and freedom in the Declaration of Independence, the former colonists revealed a willingness to appeal as well to traditional norms and guarantees. Their lapses included references to King George's imposition of a jurisdiction foreign to our Constitution, as well as abolishing the free system of English laws in a neighboring province. More generally, the Declaration of 1776 and the state declarations that followed seemed to the French to betray a tendency to focus on concrete procedural guarantees. They confused abstract rights and particular institutional protections and remedies. From the French point of view, the Americans tended to lose sight of the grandeur and purity of the new political philosophy as they focused on certain legal forms that have proved useful in their particular experience. In some respects, one could almost accuse the Americans of claiming to be more English than the empire from which they were separating. In a word, the American understanding of self-government was buttressed by a rational understanding of natural rights, but also grounded in practical political experience and limited by inherited moral and religious beliefs. Thus, the American idea of self-government was not purely rational enough for the tastes of the French philosophers and the revolutionaries they inspired. The French were persuaded that, whereas the Americans were preoccupied with specific legal forms and limitations, they owed it to themselves and to the world to address with full clarity the question of the essence of the law. The upshot of this fully rational understanding of the law was the idea that, in the last analysis, the people or nation, a collective entity, must be regarded as absolutely superior to the individual, for the rights of individuals are in fact determined by law, the voice of the general will. The individual can appeal to no authority higher than that of actual statutes legislated by all the citizens or by their representatives. In the French formulation, the effectual truth of the sovereignty of the people is the sovereignty of the legislative power. The French Revolution intellectuals believed that the Americans had not come to terms with the fact that we human beings must create for and by ourselves a ground of authority that God and nature have failed to provide. This commitment to absolute legislative sovereignty lies behind French impatience with the American doctrine of separation of powers. The economist Turgot blamed the Americans for what he deemed a thoughtless imitation of English institutions. He could not see the point of checks and balances in a system where privilege had been abolished in favor of the equal rights of all citizens. Likewise, the philosopher Condorcet found that in the American constitutions, the luster of the new political science was tainted by the prejudices of those who drafted them had imbibed in their youth. Thus, their simplicity was impaired by a determination to preserve a balance of power within the state. All this elegant limiting and balancing made no sense to the French. It only served unnecessarily to obstruct the simple truth that philosophy had discovered: the will of the people, as expressed in legislation, is sovereign. From the French point of view, Americans were falling short of rational consistency when they failed to deduce legislative sovereignty from natural rights. The difference between the American and French understandings can also be seen in the role that God plays in each. Whereas a certain supreme being is present in the French Declaration only as a passive witness mentioned in the preamble, the American Declaration holds the Creator to be the very source of man's natural equality and liberty. The claim to inalienable rights is set within a framework defined by the laws of nature and of nature's God. Human rights are not, at the deepest level, simply human assertions to be sanctioned by human power alone, but claims of moral beings within an ordered universe. For the American founders, the rule of law is not reducible to the rule of the legislative, or for that matter, judicial power, for the simple reason that human laws are presumed to be subordinate to the laws of nature and of nature's God. More precisely, ordinary legislation, as well as execution and judgment, is measured against a constitution that is in turn understood to embody the permanent principles invoked in the Declaration of Independence. Two conceptions of nature. Insofar as both declarations and both revolutions appeal to nature, to a ground of understanding presumed to be accessible to all rational human beings, rather than to some particular revelation or ancient custom, both may be said to owe much to the philosophy of the Enlightenment. But the Americans' understanding of nature, particularly human nature, was considerably richer, more subtle, and more informed by experience than the theory that guided the French. It gave place, notably, to largely traditional conceptions of honor, both political and sacred. An appeal to nature was held to be compatible with a decent respect to the opinions of mankind, to the moral standards of a humanity that already existed and did not have to be created. If American ideals of liberty and equality have been relatively effective in practice, if they have proved compatible with a decent and stable social and political order, this is because they rest on a moderate theory in which the rational appeal to natural rights does not exclude the lessons of experience and of inherited moral beliefs. The American people's understanding of the Revolution and of its motivating principles was embedded in a broadly Protestant worldview. Their enthusiasm for liberty was not cordoned off in their minds from their understanding of man's moral limits and spiritual destiny. In terms of our threefold framework, classical, modern, rationalist, and Christian, for analyzing political morality, we can say that the tendency of the French Revolution was towards a pure rationalism of human rights. The concerns for the common good of the Republic, classical, and the idea of a supreme being, a Christian legacy, were subordinated to this modern rationalism. In the American founding, on the other hand, a certain implicit balance was maintained between the three elements. The common good was largely interpreted in terms of the defense of the individual rights, but it also retained some sense of the intrinsic honor or nobility of virtue. God was generally understood publicly as nature's God or the creator of our rights, but providence also retained a certain traditional morality, traditional moral authority, and continued to represent a spiritual destiny beyond politics. Chapter 9: Benjamin Franklin's Democratic Morality. The democratic understanding of moral self-government is exemplified in the somewhat enigmatic life of Benjamin Franklin. We examine Franklin's practical or utilitarian moral vision and teachings, both of which anticipate the low but solid American ethic later described by Tocqueville as self-interest well understood. We have surveyed the main principles of the American Revolution through a brief examination of John Locke's teaching on natural rights and government by consent, and we have contrasted the natural rights teaching as it was understood in America with the more radical principles of the French Revolution. But in order to provide a foundation for a new political order, a political theory found concrete expression in national character, new ideas must be embodied in a new way of life. Benjamin Franklin's articulation of virtues of character as suited to a democratic way of life and democratic institutions provides an excellent case study in the concrete embodiment of democratic principles. John Adams wrote in 1818 that the revolution was effected before the war commenced. The revolution was in the minds and the hearts of the people, a change in their religious sentiments of their duties and obligations. This supports Tocqueville's later observation that the great advantage of the Americans is that they have arrived at a state of democracy without having to endure a democratic revolution, that they are born equal instead of becoming so. In a word, much of the transformation of the traditional moral outlook, classical and Christian, into something more modern, rationalist and democratic, have been prepared by a long colonial experience in self-government, both personal and collective. There is no better representative of the development of a new democratic understanding of personal moral self-government than Benjamin Franklin of Philadelphia. Franklin, the oldest of the leading founders, had already expressed and done much to shape a new morality for the democratic man and citizen long before the outbreak of the revolution proper. In his very careful and explicit sponsorship of a new ethic for the common man, Franklin is in a way the most democratic of the responsible gentlemen who helped to found the United States. And yet, in another sense, he is the least democratic or the least open to public understanding because he seems always to be writing behind a mask of irony, subtlety, and indirection. Benjamin Franklin's heart and mind remain somewhat of a mystery, but it is clear that he chose a democratic persona for himself in order to fashion a morality suitable to a democratic and rationalist age. Like Socrates in ancient Athens, Benjamin Franklin got himself in trouble as a young man in Boston for directly flouting conventional beliefs, but he later seems to have resolved to help create a new practical or broadly utilitarian morality for the new democratic man. Thus, Franklin was a true founder of a new democratic culture. He did much to lay the moral foundation for the political founding that was to come. Thus, we can still learn much from him about the moral foundations of democratic self-government and the moral core of a democratic education. Leo Strauss referred to the rationalism of the American founding as low but solid, a description that could be applied to Franklin's moral teaching. Franklin welcomes the support of religious sanctions in forming a moral character, and he certainly encourages and exemplifies the duties of citizenship. But the core of his moral vision is quite practical in a somewhat utilitarian sense. There is little of the sublime or otherworldly in his outlook. He values religion from the standpoint of practical moral teachings, and his favorite character traits are keyed to helping ordinary people live secure and useful lives. Thus, he anticipates the ethic of self-interest well understood, that Tocqueville would later describe as the dominant American understanding of morality. Benjamin Franklin's modest but solid virtues, captured so brilliantly in his memorable sayings, "A penny saved is a penny earned," have often been the target of scorn by artistic and intellectual elites, such as, at least since the great writer D.H. Lawrence. Quote, old Daddy Franklin will tell you, he'll rig him up for you, the pattern American. Oh, Franklin was the first downright American. He knew what he was about, the sharp little man. He set up the first dummy American, unquote. And indeed, we may judge that morality needs more support and more vision than Franklin supplied in his practical teaching. Still, reviewing Franklin's homely virtues today, we have reason to regret that this common man's morality is less common than it used to be. Part 4. Moderation, Structure, and Character in Constitutional Design. Chapter 10. Compromise, Moderation, and the Limits of Reason. An examination of the Federalist Papers numbers 37, 49, and 78 clarifies the role of compromise in a reasonable approach to politics. The importance of compromise, moreover, is linked with the fundamental importance of public opinion, and thus a popular veneration for the Constitution. Politics has been astutely defined as the art of the possible. Someone wiser added a word to this definition, the art of the best possible. Much of the same insight is reflected in a revision of what is considered the central question of political science, who rules. James Q. Wilson, in the spirit of Aristotle, added this more elusive and elevated question, and to what end? Politics is always about power, about addressing the passions and interests that are in play in a given situation, but it is always inevitably about purpose as well. Since those passions and interests are always advanced in the name of some higher principle, some idea of justice that aims to, or at least claims to transcend, mere interests. Politics is always some mix of compromising powers and arguing purposes. The American founding was no exception, although, as we have argued, it was exceptional in the important role played by convictions of moral principle and ideas of rational institutional design, exceptional, that is, in the prevalence of reflection and choice over accident and force. To understand the founders' reflection and choice, we must see that for them the application of reason to politics required precisely a recognition of the inevitable power of accident and force. In other words, a reasonable approach to politics requires compromise. Again, the contrast with the French Revolution is instructive. In that more extreme revolution, one might say, an unreasonable estimate of the power of pure reason produced a disdain for compromise and in fact contributed to the power of passions and interests. The American founders were on the whole moderate in their expectations of a rational solution to the country's political problems. They recognized their own fallibility as well as the constraints imposed by circumstances, by the facts on the ground, the elements of accident and force, passion and interest that had to be reckoned with. What has been called the miracle in Philadelphia was not so much the triumph of the pure principles of James Madison, often dubbed the father of the Constitution, or anyone else, as much as the wonder of ambitious men and powerful minds, including Madison's, accepting the sacrifice of some of their dearest notions in order to embrace and in fact promote and defend what they saw not only not necessary as the best simply, but as the best possible. Federalist number 37. Perhaps the most remarkable of the 85 Federalist Papers is number 37, in which Madison provides a profound philosophical defense of the necessity of compromise in the framing of the Constitution. This he does in order to recommend a spirit of moderation in its evaluation. He reminds his readers that a faultless plan was not to be expected, owing to the fallibility of the framers as a body of men, and asks only that the proposed Constitution's critics not assume an infallibility in prejudging the fallible opinions of others. Madison thus recognizes the necessary imperfection of the Convention's work, but reminds his readers that the Constitution itself provides, in the amendment process, a convenient mode of rectifying errors as future experiences may unfold them. The central question of principle that made compromise and imperfection impossible, Madison shows, was the imperative to combine the requisite stability and energy in government with inviolable attention due to liberty and to the Republican form. The genius of Republican liberty seems to demand, on one side, not only that all power should be derived from the people, but that those entrusted with it should be kept in dependence on the people, by a shorter duration of their appointments, and that even during the short period the trust should be placed not in a few, but a number of hands. Stability, on the contrary, requires that the hands in which power is lodged should continue for a length of time the same, unquote. In brief, to state the problem in contemporary terms, a good constitution must combine democratic with non-democratic features. And even if we accept the necessity of such a combination, The deeper problem remains that neither philosophy nor political science provides a reliable or neutral criterion for such a combination, or for resolving other questions central to the proposed constitution, such as the proper line of partition between the authority of the general and that of the state governments. The proper definition of a government's three great provinces, the legislative, executive, and judiciary, or even the privileges and powers of the different legislative branches, or the interfering pretensions of the larger and smaller states. The looming division between free and slave states was perhaps too ominous a topic to be mentioned. Human reason simply has not succeeded in clarifying such problems, which remain obscure and equivocal, and all the more so given the limitations of human language, the medium through which the conceptions of men are conveyed to each other. It is an incisive remark that could be understood as a rebuke as much to pure rationalists as to religious zealots. Madison observed that when the Almighty himself condescends to address mankind in their own language, his meaning, luminous as it must be, is rendered dim and doubtful by the cloudy medium through which it is communicated. Given the fallibility of human reason, Madison concludes, the real wonder is that so many difficulties should have been surmounted, and surmounted with a unanimity almost as unprecedented as it must have been unexpected. Given the wonder of this compromise, Madison judges it not unreasonable to give credit to Providence, effectively appealing to divine authority in support not of any single theory behind the Constitution, but of the practical result of the convention. Quote, it is impossible for any man of candor to reflect on this circumstance without partaking of the astonishment. It is impossible for the man of pious reflection not to perceive in it a finger of that almighty hand which has been so frequently and signally extended to our relief in the critical stages of the Revolution. Unquote. Federalist number 49. Madison's recognition of the limitations of reason and the necessity of compromise by no means implies a lack of appreciation for the importance of the people's strong attachment to the Constitution and to the principles it is understood to embody. On the contrary, Madison will argue in Federalist 49, the defect of rational certainty in questions of political principle can only be supplied by a habit of reverence for that which will anchor constitutional forms in the people's deepest affections and beliefs. Number 49 is, along with number 37, the Federalist's most significant and closely argued departure from the modern strategy of enlightened material interests and neutral institutional mechanisms. Here Madison argues against Jefferson's proposal for regular popular conventions that would reconsider foundations of the Constitution. Madison's polite but firm rejection of this suggestion goes to the heart of the question of the role of reason in government and politics. Quote, a nation of philosophers is as little to be expected as a philosophical race of kings wished for by Plato. The reason of man is timid and cautious when left alone, and acquires firmness and confidence in proportion to the number with which it is associated. The most rational government will not find it a superfluous advantage to have the prejudices of the community on its side. Government necessarily depends on the veneration which time bestows on everything. Unquote. Madison's argument here harkens back to a classical Aristotelian understanding of prudence or practical wisdom, in which the security of the common good lies first of all in the moral foundation of public opinion. This reasoning departs in two decisive respects from a modern rationalist understanding of republicanism or democracy. The implications of Madison's Federalist 49 extend far indeed. 1. Reason itself reveals the limits of reason. Reason depends upon conditions and assumptions it cannot create. Reason cannot wholly supply its own foundations. Reason, one might say, expanding upon Madison's argument, is surrounded and conditioned by what is below, unreason, passion, necessity, and what is above it, higher ends not reducible to physical needs, the divine. 2. Reason is by no means reducible to equal consent motivated by material self-interest. Reason distinguishes itself from common prejudice, but also takes responsibility for husbanding the more reasonable prejudices of the many, who of course do not see them as prejudices. Thus the people depend upon reverence for the founders and to some degree on respect for elected statesmen. Not even republicanism or democracy can dispense with the excellence and wisdom that exceeds democracy. To put the matter bluntly, the disposition of the people to respect moral and intellectual authority, to look up to worthy representatives, a certain elitism, is essential to the founders' view of a sound or enlightened republicanism. A constitutional people. Just what prejudices of the community the rational constitution must have on its side is never spelled out explicitly in the Federalist, but the central prejudice or shared conviction is one fundamental to constitutionalism itself, as expressed in Federalist 78. Here, the Constitution is described as a fundamental law that would authorize the Supreme Court to strike down acts of a mere legislature. But this constitutional power can only be justified by the people's wholesome prejudice in favor of the Constitution. Indeed, their identification with the Constitution with people's very right to self-government. The Constitution ought to be preferred to the statute, the intention of the people to their intention of their agents. An effective constitutional order presupposes that the people identify their own interests and their own honor with the integrity of the Constitution itself. They must see the rule of the people as the rule of the Constitution. The Constitution, however modern and rational, depends upon a people of a certain character and beliefs. Constitutional self-government depends upon a constitutional people. Constitutionalism, properly understood, thus perfectly represents the American synthesis of modern and traditional bases of political order. The Constitution is on the one hand a complex structural device, a modern arrangement of powers and systems of procedures designed to protect individual rights. It is also the product of a compromise among fallible human beings constrained by the circumstances in which they operated. At the same time, this imperfectly rational constitution can only provide a stable and effective framework for popular government if it becomes an object of popular veneration and is understood to embody a shared understanding of justice. This deep linkage between the institutional forms established by the Constitution and the moral depths of public opinion is the key to understanding Hamilton's argument in Federalist 84 against the necessity of a Bill of Rights. If, as Hamilton argues, the Constitution is itself, in every rational sense and to every useful purpose, a Bill of Right, this is because of the people's liberty ultimately depends altogether not on any fine declarations of abstract principle, but on public opinion and on the general spirit of the people and of the government. To nurture qualities of public opinion that contribute not only to understanding, but to reverence for the Constitution, and thus to a general spirit conducive to free self-government, is thus a vital function of education in a constitutional republic. Chapter 11, Structure and Design in Constitutional Design. The new political science that undergirds the founding is clearly in evidence in Federalist 51 and Federalist 10. This science contributed to prudent institutional designs, but these devices did not obviate the moral requirements of popular government. The enlarged orbit of republicanism, multiplicity of interests, separation of powers, balances, checks, and other auxiliary precautions remain insufficient without a degree of virtue in the people. The constitutional republic is not a machine that will run by itself. In addition to a founding generation of adequate character, great and virtuous men such as George Washington played a crucial role in the founding. When Thomas Jefferson learned of the Constitutional Convention as ambassador in France, he referred to those delegates attending as a race of demigods. He understood how rare it was for men of such learning and judgment to be empowered to frame a people's fundamental laws. 40 years later, when Alexis de Tocqueville visited America, he extolled the founding generation in a beautiful passage that echoes Hamilton's remarks concerning reflection and choice. Quote, "But what is new in the history of society is to see a great people, warned by its legislators that the gears of government are grinding to a halt, turn its attention to itself without rushing and without fear, sound the depths of the trouble, keep self-control for 2 whole years in order to take time to find the remedy, and when this remedy is indicated, voluntarily submit to it without costing humanity either a tear or a drop of blood." Unquote. Even though they weren't present at the Constitutional Convention, both Jefferson and Tocqueville understood that it was an extraordinary event. Before the convention, it was clear that the Articles of Confederation were inadequate and in need of revision. The inadequacy of the Articles of Confederation and the desire to improve the central government paved the way for the Philadelphia Convention. In his book, The American Revolution, Gordon S. Wood describes the monumental task of the convention. Quote, Creating a new central government was no longer simply a matter of cementing the Union, or of standing strong in foreign affairs, or of satisfying the demands of particular creditor, mercantile, and army interests. It was now a matter, as Madison declared, that would decide forever the fate of Republican government, unquote. Wood notes that there were 55 delegates representing 12 states at the Philadelphia Convention in the summer of 1787. Their average age was 42. They were well-educated gentlemen, political elites, and natural aristocrats. Some of the most influential delegates to the convention included Gouverneur Morris and James Wilson of Pennsylvania, and Edmund Randolph, George Mason, and James Madison of Virginia. Preeminent among them all was George Washington. He was chosen to preside at the convention. Notably absent from the convention were Samuel Adams, John Adams, Richard Henry Lee, Patrick Henry, and Thomas Jefferson. James Madison took a leading role in setting the agenda for the founding of a real union of states, with a national government competent to fulfill the purposes of a national government. This nationalist or federalist agenda was embodied in the Virginia Plan that Madison had prepared and that became the first locus of discussions. But Madison, along with key allies such as James Wilson of Pennsylvania, had gone much further in the direction of national powers than a majority of delegates were willing to go. Those representatives of smaller states who were suspicious of national power countered with a New Jersey plan. The contest between the two plans came to focus especially on the pivotal question of representation. Would the representatives constituting the national legislature be selected on the basis of population, to the advantage, obviously, of the more populous states, or would they represent the equal status of states as such? Much to Madison's chagrin, the convention would finally not back his cherished principle of pure population-based representation. Instead, the Connecticut Compromise fashioned a classic bargain, a House of Representatives based on population, and a Senate based on equal representation of states. Though James Madison had understandably come to be known as the father of the Constitution, he must not at first have been very eager to acknowledge his paternity. Although we may be impressed now with how much he achieved, he was then acutely aware of how many of his dear principles had been compromised away. What really earned Madison his title of constitutional father was his capacity to rebound from his disappointment and then not only to acknowledge but to embrace and defend, with his acute reasoning and powerful eloquence, the compromise that the convention had produced, and to which he had yielded only reluctantly. In providing for the ratification of the Constitution, the framers boldly bypassed the state legislatures and provided for special ratifying conventions in each of the states. 9 of 13 state ratifications were necessary for the Constitution to take effect. In the debate that followed over ratification, those who supported the Constitution called themselves Federalists, and their opponents were labeled Anti-Federalists. From the Anti-Federalist perspective, the new Constitution seemed to contradict the principles of the 1776 Revolution. The Anti-Federalists had legitimate concerns about abuses of power, the threat of monarchy, and the preservation of liberty and states' rights. Wood observes that the Federalists responded by placing sovereignty in the people. In doing so, they forged an entirely new way of thinking about the relation of government to society. It marked one of the most creative moments in the history of political thought. As a result of the intense opposition from the Anti-Federalists, the Federalists were constrained to make many compromises and concessions in order to push the Constitution toward ratification. One of the major compromises became what is now known as the Bill of Rights. See Hamilton's argument in Federalist 84, discussed in Chapter 10 above, but now largely forgotten in contemporary debates about rights, that the best Bill of Rights is the unamended Constitution itself. The Federalist is a collection of 85 articles first published in 1787 and 1788, mostly in the New York press, that argue for the ratification of the U.S. Constitution drafted in Philadelphia. To make their case, the authors Alexander Hamilton and James Madison, with 5 contributions from John Jay, provide the most careful and complete account that exists of the principles underlying this Constitution. As we have already noted with respect to the very first 2 articles of the Federalist, its argument includes prominent features of distinctly modern political theory as well as appeals to more traditional sources of order and authority. The confident embrace of reflection and choice in the first article echoed a shared sense of the responsibility that Americans of the founding generation bore for the political future of mankind. And the American people were fortunate or blessed with the opportunity to consider their choices under leadership that was extraordinary, both morally and intellectually, and on the whole, usually favorable circumstances. Hamilton's modern ambition to found political order on general rational principles, and most fundamentally on the idea of government based on rational consent of the governed, was supported by a new political science that owed much to the great French political philosopher Montesquieu. Hamilton, in Federalist 9, names many of the elements of this new political science. The history of republics or popular governments, Hamilton observes, hardly encourages optimism. While Athens and Republican Rome, for example, are known for brief periods of glorious achievement, a closer look reveals a sordid history of perpetual vibration between the extremes of tyranny and anarchy. Fortunately, though, for enlightened friends to liberty, recent advances in knowledge have included the devising of models of a more perfect structure. Quote, the science of politics, however, like most other sciences, has received great improvement. The efficacy of various principles is now well understood, which were either not known at all or imperfectly known to the ancients. The regular distribution of power into distinct departments, the introduction of legislative balances and checks, the institution of courts composed of judges holding their offices during good behavior, the representation of the people in legislators by deputies of their own election, these are wholly new discoveries, or have made their principal progress toward perfection in modern times. Unquote. Much of the Federalist consists in closely reasoned and detailed accounts of just how the proposed Constitution implements these recent advances in the science of politics, separation of powers, legislative checks and balances, an independent judiciary, all of which rests on the foundation of the principle of representation itself. In fact, the Federalist offers to the world a new understanding of the very term republic as a form of popular government in which representation replaces the direct political action of the people. The word democracy had a bad reputation for the reasons Hamilton has explained. The new political science offered structural solutions to problems that had attended popular government since its Greek beginnings. Certain all too predictable moral weaknesses endemic in human nature could be anticipated and controlled or deflected by a prudent institutional design. In one respect, at least, the framers were compelled to innovate beyond the guidelines of the new political science provided by Montesquieu. The great French thinker has agreed with the whole tradition of political theory that whereas monarchies or empires might rule over extensive territories and populations, republics were necessarily small in scope. It was left to the Americans, as Hamilton explains, to conceive of the possibility, indeed of the advisability, of an enlargement of the orbit within which such systems are to revolve. The benefits of such an enlargement are the topics of James Madison's Federalist number 10, the longest and perhaps the boldest and most far-reaching of the whole series. In Federalist number 10, we have the most complete statement in the Federalist Papers of an expansive modern view of the design of the American Constitution. The problem addresses in this most famous part of the papers is that of faction, a part organized against a whole, and especially majority faction. Madison makes a turn characteristic of the new modern political science away from moral and religious supports of citizenship and statesmanship and towards a reliance on institutional structure to channel self-interest in a way that benefits the community. He thus argues that an enlightened statesman or philosopher cannot be relied upon to solve the problem of faction, and neither can religion or morality. In fact, where factions are concerned, opinions, including notably moral and religious opinions, are very much part of the problem, since they tend to accentuate and not to control factious passions. Quote, as long as the connection subsists between his reason and his self-love, his opinions and his passions will have a reciprocal influence on each other. Unquote. In place of moral or religious constraints, then, Madison proposes that a multiplicity of interests in an extended republic will be the most effective means to tempering factions. Quote, extend the sphere and you will take in a greater variety of parties and interests. You will make it less probable that a majority of the citizens of the whole will have a common motive to invade the rights of other citizens. Unquote. And as we attend to the description Madison offers of an extended republic, it becomes clear that to extend the sphere of the republic implies not only a large geographic scope, but also an economic extension, including the expansion of specialized labor within multiplying agricultural and industrial sectors. This expansion will disperse factions among multiple trades and industries. Economic growth and diversification, along with an increasing geographic scope, help to guard against any faction that might threaten the foundation of individual liberty, that is, property rights. Like Locke, the Federalist embraces a dynamic conception of property rights, the protection of the unequal faculty of acquiring property as a touchstone of modern republicanism. Quote, the diversity in the faculties of men from which the rights of property originate is not less an insuperable obstacle to uniformity of interests. The protection of these faculties is the first object of government. From the protection of different and unequal faculties of acquiring property, the possession of different degrees and kinds of property immediately results, unquote. The modern rationalist institutionalist strategy of the Federalists might be traced further. To take another famous example, in number 51, the famous argument for institutions structured in such ways, separation of powers, balances, and checks, as to rely not on religion, virtue, or devotion to the common good, but on auxiliary precautions, brought into play by the ambitions and interests of elected officials. Ambition, quote, ambition must be made to counteract ambition, unquote. Madison thus embraces a policy of supplying, quote, a policy of supplying by opposites and rival interests the defect of better motives, unquote. By this means, quote, the private interests of every individual may be a sentinel over the public rights, unquote. Federalist 51 also offers a cogent summary of the argument of number 10 for a large republic. Quote, in the extended republic of the United States and among the great variety of interests, parties, and sects which it embraces, a coalition of a majority of the whole society could seldom take place on any other principles than those of justice and the general good, unquote. It would be a mistake, though, to conclude that the argument of the Federalist relies wholly on modern structural devices and rejects reliance on moral beliefs altogether, as if the Constitution could be a machine that would go of itself. We have already noted the very old-fashioned appeal of Federalist number 2 to a certain effective and even religious homogeneity. More generally, at the bottom of the Federalist argument is a certain moral vision that gives a large place to the individual right to acquire property. Here is Madison again in number 51, quote, justice is the end of government. It is the end of civil society. It ever has been and ever will be pursued until it is obtained or until liberty be lost in the pursuit, unquote. The content of the idea of justice, which may be said to constitute the moral glue that finally holds a system of passions, interests, and ambitions together, is named in Federalist 43 in a passage that very obviously echoes the Declaration of Independence. Madison here appeals to, quote, the great principle of self-preservation, to the transcendent law of nature and of nature's God, which declares that the safety and happiness of society are objects at which all political institutions aim, and to which all such institutions must be sacrificed, unquote. And Federalist number 55, while conceding, quote, a degree of depravity in mankind which requires a certain degree of circumspection and distrust, unquote, a caution institutionalized in the modern structural devices discussed above, is very explicit that the moral requirement of popular government remains fundamental. Quote, there are other qualities in human nature which justify a certain portion of esteem and confidence. Republican government presupposes the existence of these qualities in a higher degree than any other form. Were the pictures which have been drawn by the political jealousy of some among us faithful likenesses of the human character, the inference would be that there is not sufficient virtue among men for self-government, and that nothing less than chains of despotism can restrain them from devouring one another, unquote. Similarly, we should note that the argument of Federalist 10 for an extended republic does not rely on an expanding diversity of interests alone, but also assumes the political as well as intellectual superiority on the whole of the people's elected representatives. Madison here is by no means a populist, since he looks to the influence of a kind of natural aristocracy. Jefferson's term, not Madison's here. Quote, to refine and enlarge the public views by passing them through the medium of a chosen body of citizens, whose wisdom may best discern the true interests of their country, and whose patriotism and love of justice will be least likely to sacrifice it to temporary or partial considerations. Under such a regulation, it may well happen that the public voice, pronounced by the representatives of the people, will be more consonant to the public good than if pronounced by the people themselves convened for the purpose, unquote. If we were to ask what or whom Madison might have in mind, referring to a chosen body of citizens known for their patriotism and love of justice, a concrete answer is not far to seek. It is not a matter of a late constructed legend, but a universally acknowledged fact that the successful framing, ratification, and implementation of the U.S. Constitution depended very significantly on the character and wisdom of one eminent citizen and statesman, George Washington. Gordon Wood, a scholar not given to sentimentalist excess, affirms directly that, quote, Washington was truly a great man and the greatest president we ever had. Washington epitomized everything the revolutionary generation prized in its leaders. He had character and was truly a man of virtue, unquote. Alexis de Tocqueville observes similarly that the Constitutional Convention, quote, included the finest minds and the noblest characters that had ever appeared in the world. George Washington presided over it, unquote. Further on, he observes that the greatest cause of the superiority of the federal Constitution is in the very character of the legislators, founders, and that, quote, the Federalists, notably Washington, Hamilton, John Adams, counted in their ranks almost all of the great men of the War of Independence, and their moral power was very extensive. It was the virtue or talents of the chiefs, as well as fortunate circumstances that had carried them to power, unquote. Even though, like Gordon Wood, Tocqueville regarded the eventual decline of the Federalist influence as inevitable in a democratic society, he regarded, quote, the coming of the Federalists to power as one of the most fortunate events that accompanied the birth of the great American Union, unquote. Although not considered a great theorist of the new political science so amply employed by the framers, we should not then underestimate either the example or the ideas of George Washington as a touchstone of the meaning of the constitutional order. We might, for example, consider the contemporary relevance of the circular to the states that was very widely published on the occasion of the general's abdication of his military power. On the one hand, Washington gives ample credit to the rational progress of the Enlightenment in providing Americans the opportunity to inaugurate an unprecedented era of political felicity. Quote, the foundation of our empire was not laid in the gloomy age of ignorance and superstition, but at an epoch when the rights of men were better understood, when the rights of mankind were better understood and more clearly defined than at any former period. The researches of the human mind after social happiness have been carried to a great extent. The treasures of knowledge acquired by the labors of philosophers, sages, and legislatures through a long succession of years are laid open for our use, and their collected wisdom may be happily applied in the establishment of our forms of government, unquote. On the other hand, the father of our country associates the rational benefits of the free cultivation of letters and the unbound extension of commerce with not only the progress, quote, the progress of refinement of manners and growing liberality of sentiment, but also with the pure and benign light of revelation, unquote. And he is not at all embarrassed to give great credit to America's glorious prospects to Providence. Heaven, he writes, quote, has crowned all its other blessings by giving a fairer opportunity for political happiness than any other nation has ever been favored with, unquote. The blessings, he warns, can only be secured by avoiding decline of liberty into licentiousness, a moral decline that would lead the country back into the perennial cycle of tyranny and anarchy. Washington's appeal to shared religious beliefs is even more pronounced, if somewhat reluctant, 6 years later in his first inaugural address as president. Quote, it would be peculiarly improper to omit in this first official act my fervent supplications to that Almighty Being who rules over the universe, who presides in the councils of nations, and whose providential aids can supply every human defect, and that his benediction may consecrate to the liberties and happiness of the people of the United States a government instituted by themselves for these essential purposes. In tendering this homage to the great author of every public and private good, I assure myself that it expresses your sentiments not less than my own, nor those of my fellow citizens at large less either. No people can be bound to acknowledge and adore the invisible hand which conducts the affairs of men more than the people of the United States. Every step by which they have advanced to the character of an independent nation seems to have been distinguished by some token of providential agency, and the important revolution just accomplished in the system of their government, the tranquil deliberation and voluntary consent of so many distinct communities, from which the event has resulted cannot be compared with the means by which most governments have been established, without some return of pious gratitude, along with a humble anticipation of the future blessings which the past seem to presage. These reflections arising out of the present crisis have forced themselves too strongly on my mind to be suppressed." Unquote. Washington goes on to promise that the foundations of our national policy will be laid in the pure and immutable principles of private morality, and he affirms the central principle of the classical and Christian traditions of moral and political philosophy in unmistakable terms. Quote, "that there exists in the economy and course of nature an indissoluble union between virtue and happiness, between duty and advantage." Unquote. To summarize, the founders embraced essential points of John Locke's rational doctrine of natural rights, and they made full use of the structural strategies of the new political science developed by authors such as Montesquieu. But the principle of rational self-interest and of the institutional engineering of interests remain, in Madison's terms, auxiliary precautions to the fundamental dependency of popular government on the people as a primary control of government. A people of an adequate character is thus an indispensable condition of a republican and constitutional form of government. Education for civic participation and responsibility cannot, therefore, ignore the essential role of moral character. Part 5. Religion, Freedom, and Character Education. As we have seen from the beginning of this study, every political community must educate citizens fit to participate in, to preserve, and to contribute to the common life of that community. The good of freedom, understood as self-government, was central to the founders' understanding of a constitutional republic. In this last part, we will consider the place of religion, and then finally the meaning of civic education in such a republic. Chapter 12, Religion and Freedom in the Constitutional Republic. Religious freedom has rightly been understood to be America's first freedom, but it has become evident today that the meaning of this freedom depends on an understanding of its purpose. Contemporary understandings of this purpose are quite different from those the founders embraced. Religious freedom was a central concern of the American founding and is rightly considered to be a key achievement of American constitutionalism. But the interpretation of this achievement turns decisively on the question, why religious freedom? Just how are we to understand the purpose of religious freedom? The practical meaning and implementation of a religious freedom will always turn on a response, usually implicit, to this question. And this question finally confronts us with a stark alternative. Is religious freedom or freedom for religion, or is it freedom from religion, or can it somehow be both? Most Americans have always understood that freedom for is the dominant meaning of religious freedom. But today this is no longer so clear, as the idea that religious concerns and arguments must be rigorously excluded from the public debate and from public policy is increasingly prevalent. Thus, some public intellectuals and legal scholars have begun to argue openly that it makes no sense to distinguish religious freedom from any other form of personal interest or self-expression. On this view, religious freedom would be just one particular variant of freedom of speech and expression, and not a favored one at that. What has always been considered our first freedom, our paramount and most fundamental freedom, now appears to certain of the most advanced minds as just one claim among so many others, certainly not as important, for example, as equality understood as non-discrimination. If religious freedom has no higher status than any other claim of self-expression or identity recognition, then clearly we have moved on to the ground of freedom from religion, that is, freedom from religion understood as a source of some authoritative truth that makes real claims on the way we live as individuals, families, and communities. Such is the question of religious freedom as it arises in contemporary American society. So where did the founders and the founding generation stand on the question of religion and freedom? Is there wisdom in the founders' understanding of religion and politics that can still guide us today? Religion and politics in the founding. The founders were far from completely unified in their approach to the religious question, but all, particularly Washington, Adams, Jefferson, and Madison, valued the role of religion in the new republic. Although the founders disagreed about many aspects of religion and religious liberty, they agreed that religion was vital. Even separationist views were based on religious principles. To begin to address the question of religious freedom in the founding, we must first note the pervasiveness of religion in the ideas and sentiments of Americans, especially but not only New Englanders at the time of the founding. As we have seen in our previous discussions, the rise of the American nation through the Revolutionary and founding periods was bound up with religious sentiment and belief. And concerning the explicit arguments of the framers and the founders themselves, we affirm with confidence they understood religious freedom first of all as freedom for religion. Although there were significant differences among founders concerning the meaning of of religious truth and the politics of religious freedom, they all saw religion in one way or another as an essential positive force in Republican self-government, and moreover as an expression of what distinguishes and ennobles us as human beings, that is, of our interest in a higher truth. That is, religion was valued both for the practical purposes to which it contributed, as a sanction for the private morality and public virtue of citizens, and for its intrinsic value as pertaining to eternal truth. It is important to acknowledge, though, that there were important differences among the founders, both as to the nature of religion's benefits, more moral and practical, more intrinsically religious, and as to its public role, to be supported by government or not. In the 18th century, Stephen Waldman observes, quote, "It did not follow that one's piety determined one's views about separation of church and state. Being pro-religion didn't mean one was anti-separation, and being pro-separation didn't mean one was anti-God," unquote. What was the view of the founders on the constitutional role of religion? Waldman explains that, quote, "Each felt religion was extremely important, at a minimum to encourage moral behavior and make the land safe for Republican government. Each took faith seriously enough to conscientiously seek out a personal path that worked for him. Each rejected major aspects of his childhood religion, and none accepted the full bundle of creeds offered by his denomination. In other words, they were spiritual enough to care passionately about religious freedom, but not so dogmatic that they felt duty-bound to promote a particular faith. This combination led them to promote religious freedom rather than religion," unquote. Some we shall see, such as James Madison and Thomas Jefferson, came to emphasize freedom from religion, at least in the institutional sense, as in Jefferson's famous but not constitutional formula, separation of church and state. It is important to note, though, that even these more separationist founders understood religious freedom as a religious as well as a political principle. James Madison, in particular, argued on religious grounds that religion ought to be wholly exempt from the state's cognizance. It is precisely because ultimate spiritual truth is too important to leave to government that it must be separated from and protected from politics. There can be no more mainstream or consensual statement of the founding generation's positive view of the role of religion and religious morality in society than that of the father of our country, George Washington. Here are his famous words on religion and morality from his farewell address, quote, "Of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. In vain would that man claim the tribute of patriotism who should labor to subvert these great pillars of human happiness, these firmest props of the duties of men and citizens. The mere politician, equally with the pious man, ought to respect and to cherish them. A volume could not trace all their connections with private and public felicity. Let it simply be asked, where is the security for property, for reputation, for life, if the sense of religious obligation desert the oaths which are the instruments of investigation in courts of justice? And let us with caution indulge the supposition that morality can be maintained without religion. Whatever may be conceded to the influence of refined education on minds of peculiar structure, reason and experience both forbid us to expect that national morality can prevail in exclusion of religious principle. It is substantially true that virtue or morality is a necessary spring of popular government. The rule indeed extends with more or less force to every species of free government. Who that is a sincere friend to it can look with indifference upon attempts to shake the foundations of the fabric," unquote. Notice here that while the occasion calls for Washington to highlight the political significance of religious morality, the more practical and spiritual dimensions of religion are nicely interlaced in this statement. Religion is a pillar of human happiness bound up in myriad ways, both with private and public felicity. To gain a balanced view of Washington's view of religion and politics, we should not forget that he by no means advocated exclusive support for Christianity, much less for any particular sect of Christianity. This is evident in his famous letter to the Newport Congregation of Hebrews in 1790, quote, "The citizens of the United States of America have a right to applaud themselves for having given to mankind examples of an enlarged and liberal policy, a policy worthy of imitation. All possess alike liberty of conscience and immunities of citizenship. It is now no more than toleration is spoken of, as it were the indulgence of one class of people, that another enjoyed the exercise of their inherent natural rights. For happily the government of the United States, which gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, requires only that they who live under its protection should demean themselves as good citizens in giving it on all occasions their effectual support." Unquote. Washington's view, which holds the moral influence of religion to be essential while upholding a capacious understanding of the right to religious freedom, provides a good touchstone to the center of gravity on the religious question in the American founding. No one of any influence in 1787 for a long time after that would have contested either Washington's warm endorsement of religion and religious morality or his bold statement of the natural right to religious freedom. But how to balance society's interest in a shared religious morality with the individual's right to religious freedom has been a challenging question from the beginning. The leading founders were not at all in agreement on how these two sides of the religious question might be reconciled. Many, like John Adams, thought that some support for a kind of general Christianity fell within the necessary and legitimate purposes of government. Others were much more concerned with the dangers inherent in mixing politics and religion. Jefferson and Madison, most notably, considered it essential to Republican freedom that institutional religion be rigorously separated from political power. It is in this sense that there was also an aspect of freedom from religion in the founders' conception of Republican freedom. Just how far organized religion and government needed to be separated was a question on which leading thinkers were very much divided. Many of the new state constitutions drafted after the Declaration of Independence included systems of assessment for plural establishments. That is, taxes were collected and directed toward the support of clergy of various Christian denominations according to the affiliation of those assessed. As is well known, Jefferson and Madison opposed such multi-denominational assessments, and it is within this context that they insisted, more than any other leading founders, upon the separation of organized religion from governmental policy and authority. But it would be wrong to identify their views with those of contemporary secularists. Jefferson and Madison both favored separation precisely because they saw it as the surest means to encourage a society's vital interests in higher truths. Madison's policies, in particular, were closely allied with the views of ardent religious believers who were members of minority denominations. And it should be mentioned that in this conflict over government's non-denominational support of religion, their indispensable allies in this cause of a stricter separation were the more radical dissenting Christian sects who, like the more philosophical Jefferson and Madison, distrusted what they saw as the power-seeking of the older, more established denominations. Thus, there is Madison's view, as stated in the famous Memorial and Remonstrance against Religious Assessments, circulated in Virginia in 1785, that government should stay out of religious questions altogether, an argument based upon the priority of man's, quote, duty toward the Creator to the claims of civil society, unquote. Madison was more opposed to governmental support for religion than many of his founding colleagues precisely because he believed that the joint prosperity of religious and civil society are best secured by their strict separation. Madison's rhetoric is indeed more progressive than was the norm for the founders, as is clear in his enthusiasm for leveling as far as, quote, leveling as far as possible every obstacle to the victorious progress of truth. But it must not be overlooked that he continues to associate this progressive truth with, quote, the diffusion of the light of Christianity, unquote. Madison is naturally cited as an authority for a strict separationist view of the relationship between church and state, but this irony tends to be overlooked by those who wish to exclude religious arguments altogether from public debates. Madison's case for keeping religion out of government and government out of religion was a religious argument. Does a strict separationist view cancel out its own religious premises? Jefferson's view of religion were still more unconventional, and you may know that he looked forward to a day when Unitarianism would replace traditional Christianity as the dominant American religion. But even in his case, it is important to note that he by no means celebrates pure individual freedom as a self-sufficient ethic, but trusts ultimately in the progressive effects of, quote, reason and free inquiry, unquote, to support the emergence of, quote, the true religion, unquote. As in the case of Madison, Jefferson's progressivism is rooted not in his dismissal of any universal moral truth, but in his confidence that, quote, the truth can stand by itself, unquote. And this truth is by no means a purely secular truth of individual self-interest and political utility, but indeed has as its center the quote pure and perfect, unquote, moral teachings of Jesus, which include an ethic of universal love for humankind. Jefferson and Madison certainly went further than other founders in insisting on a separation between church and state. But though they disagreed with their countrymen who favored mild plural state establishments, they agreed with them on the importance of religious morality and of the search for religious truth. In this sense, they share more with contemporary religious conservatives than with today's secular separationists. But they certainly disagreed with the proponents of non-denominational establishments concerning the best policies to support this morality and this openness to a higher truth. In a word, in the broadly progressive and sometimes millennialist hopes of the founding generation, the line between the secular and the religious is exceedingly hard to trace, or perhaps simply non-existent. An increase in religious truth was intermingled in the American mind of the early republic with an anticipation of progress in the realms of morality, politics, and economic well-being. Chapter 13, Religion and the Constitution. The Constitution demanded a paradigm shift for the people on the question of religion and politics, but there is no single theory behind the provisions regarding religion in the First Amendment. Tocqueville helps us to see the deep connection between the spirit of religion and the spirit of freedom that underlies American republicanism. Freedom is essential to religion, and religion is essential to freedom. What did the Constitution of 1787 actually decide on the matter of religion and politics, or church and state? In a sense, one could say not much. The federal Constitution prohibited the imposition of any religious test as a requirement for office. This, and more generally, the absence of any religious language in the Constitution, unlike the Declaration of Independence, may be seen as a bold step toward secular government. But one, the Constitution was widely understood to rest on the principles of the Declaration, where religious language is important. And two, the scope of the national government was considered to be very limited, and the states were left free under the very broad police powers they retained to weigh the public interest in religion as they saw best. Quote, the absence of God from the Constitution, Waldman explains, was pro-religion, but in a way that was not obvious to all. Much of the population had been raised to believe that to ensure a religion's health, the state must support it. The Constitution demanded a paradigm shift away from public responsibility toward private, unquote. The religious provisions of the First Amendment to the Constitution are likewise of little use, at least as originally understood, in settling the question of religion and politics. As Waldman shows in Founding Faith, already at the beginning of the Republic, different people saw different things in the prohibition of laws respecting an establishment of religion, as well as in the protection of free exercise. Madison and his evangelical allies hoped to widen the separation between church and state, but others accepted the amendment as the means of preserving the state's authority to accommodate various denominations in general governmental support for religion, indeed, for the most part, for Protestant Christianity. Despite what the Supreme Court of the 20th century would claim to find in the original rationale for the First Amendment, it was a classic political compromise that left open the underlying philosophical question of the relation between religion and politics. The spirit of religion and the spirit of freedom. Religious freedom is only possible as a stable social and political good insofar as each of the two terms, religion and freedom, is publicly understood, if only implicitly, to contain or refer to the other. Religious freedom has prospered in America insofar as freedom is understood to be essential to religion, the soul's free response to God, as well as religion essential to freedom, the human spirit's transcendence of material necessity and political power. Freedom must be understood as inherently religious in the minimal sense of being oriented towards some higher reality, as connected with some higher vocation for humanity. Human freedom to be honored and protected cannot be understood as pure arbitrary decision, as blind willfulness, as scientific mastery of nature, or as sheer self expression or self creation. Under a relativistic idea of freedom or equality by default, religious freedom and not only religious freedom will ever be more vulnerable to the demands of non-discrimination or of identity politics. Reciprocally, religion must already imply freedom. The divine must be understood in such a way as to ground our appreciation of the dignity of every human soul as capable of a free and knowing communion with what is highest. If our relation to what is divine or ultimate is understood to be one of sheer obedience or submission, either to the one and the only God or to the one and only principle of material necessity, then freedom can have no secure standing in our public order. As Tocqueville saw, the marvelous combination that America exhibited of the spirit of religion and the spirit of freedom rested ultimately on the underlying real community between these spirits, that is, on the grounding of the equal dignity of human beings in the Christian understanding of a God who transcends all political power and all social hierarchy. The transcendence of our freedom, both personal and political, is a historical legacy of Christianity, but it is a good that can be appreciated by many who do not confess a Christian faith. Chapter 14, Civic Education and the Founding. Glaucon's challenge to Socrates in Plato's Republic raises the question of the fundamental purposes of education, both civic and liberal. The founders of the American Republic, particularly Madison, Washington, Rush, Jefferson, Webster, can help us to understand the purpose of education for liberty in our time, especially as formal education relates to the people's informal education, that is, their moral and religious traditions. When Glaucon in Plato's Republic challenged Socrates to show that it is good to be just or lawful, to do the right thing morally, he distinguished between two kinds of goodness. Everyone grants that justice is good in the sense of useful to the city, the political community, to society, as we now say. Society does not work without generally observed rules, but Glaucon wanted Socrates to show the goodness of justice in a deeper sense. He wanted to be convinced that justice is good, not only extrinsically, that is, for its social benefits, but also that it is good intrinsically, that is, from the standpoint of the individual's own well-being. In the rest of the Republic, Socrates then attempts to answer Glaucon's challenge by showing that justice or morality is not merely a social necessity, but in fact corresponds to the flourishing of the human soul. Glaucon's question about justice applies to the question of the purposes of education. Is education only about the provision of useful skills, competencies necessary for the material preservation and prosperity of the individual as part of the social and economic order? Or does education finally serve a higher purpose? Does it aim at intrinsic goods? Is education at least as much about building human beings capable of moral and spiritual fulfillment as it is about producing well-behaved producers? As Plato understood, education in its full meaning involves nothing less than the shaping of the human soul, the formation of the student's character. The provision of practically useful capacities and competencies cannot be divorced from the developments of the habits, dispositions, and moral orientation of the young person. And the cultivation of these moral habits must be seen to be not only useful in terms of social and political necessities, but conducive to the intrinsic goodness and happiness of the individual. Plato's reflection on the ground of moral obligation is thus immediately relevant to any inquiry into the purposes of education. Plato's defense of the intrinsic goodness of justice or morality, a defense to which we can only allude here, points us to the core meaning of what in the Western tradition has been called liberal education, that is, the education of the free person. Liberal education is education for freedom, and freedom here is that of a person formerly the gentleman or aristocrat, not enslaved to his bodily appetites or bound by his circumstances to confine his learning to that which is useful to material security and comfort. The freedom of liberal education would then be or aim at the freedom of the mind or soul to cultivate and enjoy those goods proper to it. What can the founders of the American Republic teach us concerning the freedom of the life of the mind pursued for its own sake? Unsurprisingly, the founders' main or explicit preoccupation where freedom or liberty is concerned is not the higher freedom of the mind or soul, but the freedom immediately connected with political institutions. In his notes on the state of Virginia, Jefferson appears to propose political and economic ends as the main justification of a proposed system of education, including higher education. The most complete education would be limited to the superior half of 20 of the best geniuses to be raked from the rubbish annually, or not solely for their own individual fulfillment, but in order to, quote, avail the state of those talents which nature has sown as liberally among the poor as the rich, unquote. The meritocracy Jefferson envisages makes it clear that the principle of equality that guides his thought has more to do with what we call, quote, equality of opportunity, unquote, than, quote, equality of result, unquote. Those who are intellectually gifted but not financially fortunate are to be given aid in order to allow their talents to rise to the top and to be of use to themselves and to others. And what view of human fulfillment or happiness seems to guide Jefferson's educational thought? We note that he is here quite dismissive of the dominant religion of his compatriots, urging against, quote, putting the Bible and Testament into the hands of the children at an age where their judgments are not sufficiently matured for religious inquiries, unquote. He gives priority instead to, quote, Grecian, Roman, European, and American history, unquote, with a view to especially training the youth, quote, as judges of the actions and designs of men, enabling them to know ambition under every disguise it may assume, unquote. Jefferson's main focus then seems to be a kind of defensive appreciation of threats to freedom. Insofar as the first elements of morality are concerned, Jefferson is content to let individuals work out their own greatest happiness, apparently confident enough in the general effectiveness of a good conscience, unsupported by any specific moral, not to mention religious education. This trust in a natural and universal faculty of conscience, unsupported by any particular religious formation, helps explain Jefferson's trust in the people as the only safe depository of free institutions of government. While government by the few has proved, even in Great Britain to be corruptible by monetary inducements, he cannot imagine anyone owning the resources to corrupt the people as a whole. James Madison's letter to Jefferson regarding education is of much later date, but he is responding to a proposal of Jefferson's from 1799 and in a general way to Jefferson's vision already presented in the notes on the state of Virginia. Madison here displays the same readiness to revise and temper the thoughts of his senior political partner, as we saw in his reply in Federalist 49 to Jefferson's plan for periodic constitutional conventions. Madison agrees with Jefferson that education must be informed by an accepted political doctrine and orthodoxy in fact, but he counsels Jefferson on the difficulty of framing a political creed, a difficulty strictly parallel to that faced by theologians. Such a creed must be specific enough to do its work of rightly informing the mind, but not so specific as to divide and exclude where meant to unite and fortify. In order to broaden the appeal of Jefferson's curriculum, Madison recommends two famous speeches by President Washington. Interestingly, both of these speeches, the inaugural speech and the farewell address, accord a far more ample role to the traditional religious beliefs of Americans than Jefferson himself was inclined to do. In his farewell address, Washington urges the primary importance of institutions for the general diffusion of knowledge, not, it appears, for the pure sake of untrammeled learning, but because, quote, virtue or morality is a necessary spring of popular government, unquote. And since, quote, reason and experience both forbid us to expect that national morality can prevail in exclusion of religious principle, unquote, the education Washington intends to promote must have a religious dimension. Though this does not necessarily imply an explicit role for religion in higher education, Washington clearly recommends a moral and political function as among the advantages of a proposed national university. Such a university, which would make education in the science of government a primary object, would encourage the, quote, assimilation of the principles, opinions, and manners of our countrymen, and thus make our citizens more homogeneous, unquote. And in case you are wondering how political science classes might be expected to produce homogeneity, Washington, in a later letter, specifies that by enlightening citizens, he has in mind, quote, giving them just ways of thinking, unquote. To be sure, Washington's idea of just ways of thinking, however representative in general of the founding generation cannot be simply identified in every particular with the views of all the founders. On the religious question in particular, Madison, like Jefferson, would be inclined to emphasize that, quote, religion and government will both exist in greater purity the less they are mixed together, unquote. As we have seen, however, this in no way allows us to conclude that Madison has in mind anything like our contemporary open-ended idea of liberal education. If these examples of political constraint on free learning are not enough to disqualify the founders as spokesmen for liberal education, then we might consider the still more unabashed statements of Benjamin Rush. Rush recommends, quote, one general and uniform system of education to render the mass of the people more homogeneous. Such a system would be based upon the religion of the New Testament and would make it possible, in Rush's words, to convert men into Republican machines, unquote. The quote, wills of the people, he explains, must be fitted to each other by means of education before they can be made to produce regularity and unison in government, unquote. Rush thus agrees with Jefferson and Madison on the need to inculcate a Republican creed, but unlike them, certainly unlike Jefferson, Rush understands Christianity and republicanism to be in perfect harmony. Virtue is necessary to liberty, religion is necessary to virtue, and Christianity is a religion that is perfectly suited to republicanism. Quote, a Christian cannot fail of being a Republican, unquote. In a similar vein, Noah Webster looks to a cooperation between the statesman and the divine, republicanism and Christianity, to provide the foundation of a general system of education, a distinctively American education appropriate to the new American republics. In overview, the thought of the founders on education, including in some of the respects higher education, may be summarized in three interrelated characteristics. One, it is plainly and directly political. It aims at assimilating citizens or making them in some sense the same. Two, it depends on the inculcation of morality and in many versions religion. And three, it looks to the cultivation of a national elite or national aristocracy. What then has the founders' view of education, homogeneous political elitist? What has this view to teach us regarding liberal education in our day, a day of diversity, equality, and openness? If we are to learn something from the founders' views of education, the place to begin is to recognize that every view of education, if it is minimally coherent, embodies and seeks to advance some moral political understanding. Every idea for educating human beings involves some notion of what is a fully educated or complete human being, some notion, that is, of human virtue. Modern education for democracy in the light of the founding. Modern educational ideas do not differ from the founders by somehow being neutral or non-committal on the vision of humanity that inspires them. They differ in advancing, to be sure, less candidly than the founders did, another vision of human virtue. A good example of this vision can be gathered by connecting a few dots in a book that serves as a kind of standard for training public educators in a larger vision of their enterprise. Education for Everyone, Agenda for Education and Democracy. The key premise of this vision is that no institution exists, quote, no institution exists in the modern world other than that are public schools that can begin to fulfill this most essential responsibility of moral and civic education. Formal schooling is our sole public resource, the only place where, as a collective, self-conscious public pursuing common goods, we try to shape our children to live in a democratic world, unquote. What should we make of this claim that formal schooling is our only public resource, the only possible source of common purpose and social cohesion? Certainly, we can readily admit that moral and political education today faces challenges quite unlike and in some ways more radical than those faced by our founding generation. The cultural and religious homogeneity that John Jay invoked in Federalist No. 2 as a support for American nationhood was no doubt even then a little less solid than he lets on. In any case, our challenges of diversity are certainly unlike those of 1787, but it is a big and momentous step from this observation to the claim that no unifying beliefs and sentiments exist to the practical conclusion embraced quite enthusiastically by the authors of Education for Everyone. Therefore, we public educators can ourselves construct a viable moral system and instill it in our students' hearts and minds. Our society is a moral vacuum, but no problem, we can fill it. Quote, public schools must be understood as public not simply because they serve the public, but because they establish us as a public, unquote. It is not quite the case, however, that education for everyone sees American society simply as a moral vacuum. Rather, it sees moral and religious content that tends to resist the project of true democratic education. Quote, society undoes each workday what the school tries to do each school day, unquote. Public education, in order to advance its democratic mission, must confront a given society not as a mere vacuum or blank slate, but as an antagonist. This is especially true where the question of religion is concerned. In the view of education for everyone, America remains, quote, a last best hope for mankind. As Tocqueville was persuaded, religion may be simply another form of hope. To him, unbelief was always an accident and faith the only permanent state of mankind, but it is hope rather than religion that we cannot do without. And in this absence of religion, the ideal of a self-constituted nation still offers hope, unquote. True democratic education is thus based on a post-religious hope, an educational replacement for traditional religion. And traditional religion clearly needs and deserves to be replaced, even if prevailing ideas of religious freedom present an obstacle to the advancement of this secular religion. Quote, clearly parents have the right to teach their children any creed, however individualized and antisocial they wish. The question is why a society would want to encourage it, unquote. The progressive project of public education advanced by Education for Everyone is thus far from neutral or objective regarding moral and political visions. It is informed rather by a quite recognizable post-religious religion that focuses on the ideal of democracy itself. It is not the business of this book to spell out all the ramifications of this religion of democracy, but its outlines are clear enough in the following passage. Quote, the construction of narratives is a major business of our species. Agreement on major narratives has been largely reached. Human beings everywhere already share a vast catalog of beliefs, emotions, perceptions, and understandings about the world we share. This commonality creates the necessary condition for the human conversation, unquote. The ethic that informs public education and its efforts against the resistance of the larger society's accepted religious beliefs, which are individualistic and antisocial, is the emerging ethic not of any particular religion or country, but of the human species as a whole. Apparently, the conversation of humanity has already advanced far enough that the essentials are in place for the construction of a world religion of humanity, if only the remaining antisocial resistance of traditional religion and individualism can be overcome. I will leave it to the reader to judge of the adequacy and indeed the truth of this emerging world religion of humanity. Let us conclude simply with a few comparative observations from the standpoint of the American founders. The key difference between the modern ambitions of education for everyone and the founders' hopes regarding education concerns the relation of these ambitions to the existing state of actual public education. This can be seen in considering this relation in two main areas, religion and nationhood. The ambitions of education for everyone are in important respects like those of the French Revolution. Recall Tocqueville's observations that the French Revolution was like a religious revolution in that it sought to regenerate humanity as a whole, but in this case, the transformation depended not on a supernatural truth, but on a simple system of purely rational principles. Education for everyone has similar confidence in humanistic substitute for religion, our species' vast catalog of beliefs, emotions, etc. But the emphasis in this case seems to be less on deliberate reason and more on the historically evolved attitudes of those representing the point of view of our species as a whole. In any case, the disposition of the new religion of humanity toward particular antisocial beliefs inherited from traditional religions often seems similar to that of the French revolutionaries. The American founders are obviously friendlier to traditional religion and to Christianity in particular. Thomas Jefferson may, in some respects, be considered an exception. He was among leading founders, no doubt, the most suspicious of the institutional influence of inherited religion, and indeed he hoped and expected that a Unitarianism, a kind of rationalized essence of biblical religion, would soon become the dominant American belief system. Although equally committed to religious freedom and the end of religious establishments, Jefferson's Virginian colleague, James Madison, was consistently more attentive to and respectful of the existing content of public opinion. We have seen that he warned Jefferson of trying to accomplish too much with an explicit political creed, and we know from Federalist 49 in particular that Madison understood the positive role of faith or prejudice and the reverence that time bestows. Among the other founders we have briefly surveyed, Christianity is clearly seen as a friend or even as the essential basis of republicanism. Washington, for his part, does not single out Christianity, but alludes to religion generally, that is, to the existing inherited religious beliefs of his compatriots as an essential support of the private virtue necessary to Republican government. Finally, the American founders connected education with political liberty, with active citizenship in a particular nation in a way different from the modern promotion of democratic values to be shared by humanity as a whole. In an 1822 letter, Madison asks, quote, "What spectacle can be more edifying or more seasonable than that of liberty and learning, each leaning upon the other for their mutual and surest support," unquote. A striking feature of the founders, especially George Washington's educational ideas, is their preoccupation with national honor and national character. Contemporary advocates of learning for its own sake could learn from the founders that the liberty of liberal education would lose all form and meaning without implicit reference to a shared and noble understanding of political liberty. Quote, "The genius and excellence of the arts," Gouverneur Morris wrote, "depend upon a greater liberty than that reducible to base calculation. Greatness in the life of the mind must be nourished by national greatness, by the high, haughty, generous, and noble spirit which prizes glory more than wealth and holds honor dearer than life," unquote. Similarly, James Wilson declared in the Philadelphia Convention itself that the improvement of the mind is the highest end of constitutional government. Gouverneur Morris and James Wilson, no doubt, went further than other founders in associating the improvement of the mind with active political liberty and with the honor associated with the nation. But every educational vision looks up to some understanding of virtue, of what constitutes an excellent, well-ordered, and happy human being. And every vision of a good human being is bound up with some understanding of a good society. The American founders' understanding of education was informed by respect for, one, the religion, and two, the active political liberty of the particular people they were helping to form. In sum, education for the founders necessarily looked up to God and to country. It is a fair question whether a modern narrative or conversation concerning a vast catalog of beliefs shared by the whole world can replace these foundations of reverence in an educational vision.